Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxing History Time. Tonight we begin not with a grand event, but with a narrowing of light. You stand just inside a doorway as evening settles over a modest home in 1700 America. The sun slips lower, turning the yard outside into a wash of grey and amber. Inside, the air feels thicker, holding the day's work like a long breath finally being released. You can already tell this is not the kind of supper where comfort arrives instantly. You probably won't survive this if you expect warm lighting, soft chairs, and a table set just for pleasure. Supper here is earned. It comes at the end of labour, not as a reward for leisure. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you live right now. Now dim the lights and let your eyes adjust as the story moves forward. You feel twilight before you really see it. The room does not suddenly grow dark. Instead, edges soften. Corners retreat. The last daylight slides sideways across the floorboards and pauses near the hearth as if reluctant to leave. This is the hour when the household begins to pull inward. Tools are set aside, hands are wiped on aprons or trousers, boots are nudged off near the door, not neatly, just close enough to be found again in the morning. A commonly accepted historical detail settles easily into this moment. In many 1700s American household, supper was the main communal meal of the day, eaten after work was done and before full darkness made movement difficult. There were no electric lights to stretch the evening. Candles were precious. Oil lamps smoked and needed tending, so the timing of supper followed the sun more than the clock. You notice how people arrive at the room in stages. No one announces the meal. There is no bell. A child wanders in, first drawn by smell more than instruction. An older woman follows already, rubbing her hands together, as if she can feel the warmth of the hearth from across the room. Someone else lingers outside a moment longer, finishing a task that cannot quite be left unfinished. The smells reach you before the table does. Wood smoke clings to clothing and hair, carrying the sharp memory of the fire that has burned all day. Beneath it, softer notes gather. Boiled grains, cooked roots, a hint of fat if the family is lucky enough to have it tonight. The air remembers meals here. Even after bowls are emptied, the room will hold on to these scents, letting them drift and settle into the walls. There is a small, almost humorous detail that historians like to mention when discussing early American meals. In some rural homes, the table was not a permanent piece of furniture at all, but a board laid across trestles and taken down when space was needed. Supper in those cases literally transformed the room for a short while before it returned to something else. You step closer and notice the table tonight is already standing rough and scarred, its surface bearing the quiet record of years of use. Knife marks cross it in no particular pattern. A dark stain near one edge hints at a past spill no one bothered to scrub away. Chairs do not match. A bench sits where another chair might have been wide enough for 2 children or 1 tired adult. As the light continues to fade, conversation stays minimal. This is not rudeness, it is conservation. Words cost energy, and energy has already been spent in the fields, the workshop, the yard. When someone does speak, it is practical. A short instruction, a reminder, a question about whether the fire needs more wood. One interpretation often raised by social historians is that silence at the table was not a sign of emotional distance but of shared exhaustion. People who worked together all day did not need to fill the evening with talk to feel connected. Presence did much of that work for them. You feel your own body responding to the rhythm of the room. Your shoulders drop, your breathing slows. The long day has trained everyone here to move efficiently without excess. Even anticipation feels restrained. Supper will come, it always does. There is no need to rush it with excitement. Someone sets out bowls one by one, placing them where hands will naturally reach. There is no place setting in the modern sense. No forks waiting politely. Knives appear only when needed, carried in from belts or shelves. A single spoon might be shared between 2 people, wiped quickly on bread between uses. The fire shifts and settles, sending a soft crackle through the room. Sparks jump briefly and then disappear. The sound is familiar enough to fade into the background like breathing. Fire here is not decoration. It is the quiet engine of the household, and everyone is aware of its moods. Scholars still argue whether families in this period experienced supper primarily as a social ritual or as a functional pause between work and sleep. The evidence can point in both directions depending on the household, the region, and the season. Standing here, you can feel how both ideas might be true at once. A child swings their legs under the bench heels, brushing the wood in a soft, repetitive rhythm. No one tells them to stop. Another person leans forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the bowls being filled. Hunger is not dramatic. It is steady, patient, and very real. Outside night gathers fully now. The last light drains from the window, replaced by reflections of flame and shadow. The world beyond the walls becomes less important. Inside, everything narrows to warmth, food, and the shared understanding that this moment matters even if no one says so out loud. He realizes that supper here is not about abundance or choice, and it is about continuity, about ending the day in a way that feels known and reliable. The same motions, the same space, the same quiet agreement that tomorrow will come, and this pattern will repeat. As bowls are finally drawn closer and bodies lean in, the room feels complete in a way that has nothing to do with fullness. It is the completeness of routine, of having reached the point in the day where nothing more is demanded of you, except to sit, eat, and be present. And as you settle into that feeling, the first bites are taken, and the long evening of shared experience begins to unfold. The first thing you really notice once everyone has settled close enough to the table is how smell leads the experience. Your eyes are still adjusting to the dim light, but your nose has already mapped the meal. The air is layered, not sharp, not dramatic, just full. It carries the steady warmth of cooked food that has been waiting patiently held near the fire until all hands were ready. Steam lifts lazily from the bowls as they are set down. It does not rush upward. It drifts, curling and thinning as it meets cooler air near the ceiling. You breathe it in without thinking, the way people here do after a long day, and you feel something in your chest ease. Hunger is answered first by scent. Taste comes later. There is a grounded truth often mentioned by historians of everyday life. In many 1700s American homes, cooking and eating happened in the same room, often within a few steps of the hearth. There was no effort to hide food preparation. Smell was not something to manage or minimize. It was part of how a household functioned, signaling nourishment, timing, and reassurance all at once. You notice how no one comments on the smell. No one says it looks good or smells good. Compliments are not the currency here. A meal that reaches the table has already done its job. Talking about it would feel unnecessary, maybe even strange. As you lean slightly forward, another layer becomes clear. Earthiness. The deep, quiet scent of roots pulled from storage, cooked slowly until they softened and sweetened. There was also a faint bitterness, likely from greens that grew stubbornly, even when the soil was tired. And underneath it all, the constant note of smoke, not harsh, just present, woven into everything from hair to fabric, to fabric to food. A curious little detail shows up in letters and diaries from the period. Some people remark that they could tell what their neighbours were eating just by walking past their homes at supper time. Smell travelled freely through open doors, thin walls and shared yards, turning entire streets into quiet menus. You become aware that smell here is memory. This room has carried these same notes again and again, night after night. Even when the bowls are empty later, the scent will linger, softening the space long after voices fade. It settles into the grain of the wood, into the fibres of clothing hung nearby, into the sense of what evening feels like. Someone shifts a bowl closer to you. The movement is small but deliberate. No one asks if you want more or less. Portions are not negotiated verbally. You take what is given, knowing adjustments can come later if needed. The smell intensifies as the bowl moves warm and inviting in a way that feels earned rather than indulgent. There is an interpretation some scholars offer when discussing sensory life in early America. They suggest that smell played a larger role in daily awareness than it does for many people today, partly because it carried information. Food safety, freshness, even social boundaries were often judged by scent before sight or taste. You understand that instinctively now. The smell tells you the food is safe. It tells you it has been cooked long enough. It tells you quietly that the household has done what it needed to do today. A child leans too close and fogs the air above their bowl with eager breath. Someone gently nudges them back, not with words, but with a light touch on the shoulder. The smell is strong enough without rushing. Patience is part of eating here. The room absorbs sound differently now. The crackle of the fire blends with the soft scrape of wood on wood as bowls are adjusted. Breathing becomes more noticeable. There's a rhythm to it, a collective inhale and exhale that rises and falls with anticipation. You realize that smell also shapes behavior. People sit closer together than they might otherwise. The warmth and scent draw bodies inward, tightening the circle around the table. Distance would only dilute the experience. One lesser known but often repeated anecdote from the era involves travellers describing how they could find their way back to a farmhouse at night by following the smell of supper drifting into the road. Food became a beacon, a sign of shelter and humanity in the dark. As you prepare to take your first bite, you notice how the smell shifts slightly. The heat from the bowl releases new notes as the surface is disturbed. A richer aroma rises, hinting at fat or broth that had been hidden beneath. It feels almost like a quiet reveal, a reward for waiting. Historians still argue whether people in this period experienced food primarily through necessity or through pleasure. Some accounts emphasize scarcity and monotony. Others describe moments of real enjoyment, even pride. Sitting here breathing in the layered air, you sense that pleasure and necessity are not opposites. They overlap them. Someone nearby sighs a long, slow breath that carries relief more than excitement. It is the sound of a body recognizing that it can finally stop working. Smell plays its part in that recognition, signaling that the day has reached a safe harbor. Outside, the night deepens, but inside, the room feels increasingly grounded. The smell of supper creates a boundary, an invisible wall that holds warmth and familiarity close. Whatever worries waited beyond the door feel less urgent now, softened by the promise of nourishment. You lift your spoon finally and the scent follows it upward. Even before the food touches your mouth, your body has already begun to respond. Muscles relax, focus narrows. The world contracts gently around the table. And as the first mouthful is taken, the smell does not disappear. It stays hovering, reminding you that this meal is not just something you eat, but something you inhabit fully and quietly as the evening continues to unfold. Once the first bites are taken and the immediate edge of hunger softens, your attention drifts outward again. That is when the table itself becomes impossible to ignore. It is not impressive. It does not try to be. The wood beneath your hands feels uneven, worn smooth in some places and splintered in others. You can trace shallow grooves left by years of knives, each one a quiet record of past meals. This table does not ask you to admire it, it asks you to use it. A widely accepted historical fact fits neatly here. In many 1700s, American homes furniture was built for durability rather than beauty. Tables were often homemade or purchased from local craftsmen constructed from whatever timber was available. Decoration was minimal, not because people disliked beauty, but because function mattered more in daily survival. You shift slightly on your seat and notice the chair beneath you answers with a soft creak. It is solid, but it has learned the language of weight over time. The legs are not perfectly even. One corner rocks just a little when you lean back too far. No one apologizes for this. No one offers to fix it. The chair is doing its job well enough. Nearby, a bench runs along one side of the table. Two children share at knees, nearly touching their feet, dangling just above the floor. Benches were common practical solutions that allowed more bodies to fit into a tight space. They encouraged closeness without discussion. There is a small, almost endearing detail that appears in probate inventories from the period. Families often owned fewer chairs than people relying on benches, stools, or even upturned crates when needed. Sitting down was less about personal comfort and more about being included. Your hands rest on the table again, palms flat, and you notice the temperature of the wood. It holds the day's warmth faintly, but not much. The surface has cooled as the light faded. There is no tablecloth tonight. Cloth was worked clean, and this surface has already seen enough. As you eat crumbs, collect without ceremony. They stay where they fall until someone brushes them aside with a sleeve or the back of a hand. Cleanliness here is practical, not ornamental. The table is not a stage. It is a tool. One interpretation often raised by material culture historians is that rough furniture shaped behavior. Without delicate surfaces to protect people moved more freely, leaned more honestly, and worried less about making small messes. Living left marks, and those marks were accepted. You glance at the legs of the table and notice one has been reinforced with an extra brace added long after the table was first built. Someone noticed a weakness once and addressed it in the simplest way possible. That repair remains visible and unashamed. A quirky little anecdote survives in a few household records. Some families deliberately avoided smoothing their tables too much, believing rough surfaces discouraged pests and made spills less slippery. Whether or not that worked is debatable, but the belief itself tells you something about priorities. You become aware that the table also shapes posture. People lean forward more than you might at a modern table. Elbows come down naturally. Backs curve. Eating is a whole body activity, grounded and direct. No one sits back and surveys the room. Attention stays close to the bowl. The table's height feels slightly off by the modern standards. It is lower, encouraging you to hunch just a little. That posture is familiar to everyone here. It matches the way they work, the way they move through the day. Comfort is not about alignment or support, it is about familiarity. Historians still argue whether early American households consciously valued simplicity, or whether simplicity was simply the byproduct of necessity. Standing here, or rather sitting here, you sense that the distinction barely matters. The result is the same. The table exists. It works. It holds the meal. Someone drags a stool closer with a muted scrape. The sound blends easily into the room, unnoticed after a moment. Furniture noises are part of the household's background rhythm. Silence would feel stranger. As you reach for another bite, your sleeve brushes the table edge and you feel a nick in the wood catch briefly on fabric. It does no harm. It's just there, another small reminder that nothing in this room is polished for display. There is a quiet confidence in that. This table has supported countless suppers. It has heard arguments and prayers, laughter and long stretches of quiet chewing. It does not need to be replaced when tastes change. It will likely outlast many of the people sitting around it now. A lesser discussed but intriguing point appears in some scholarly debates. Researchers still debate how much emotional attachment families felt toward their furniture. Was it just property, or did it become part of family identity? Looking at the worn surface, it is easy to imagine children learning to walk by holding onto this edge. Elders resting tired hands here after work. The table anchors the room in a very literal way. Everything else orbits it during supper. Bowls, hands, voices, even lights seem to gather here. The fire flickers, casting shadows that dance across the tabletop, making the scars and grooves shift and deepen. You realize that fancy furniture would almost interrupt this moment. A polished surface might reflect too much light, demand too much attention. This table disappears into use, allowing the meal itself to take center stage. As plates scrape softly and people adjust their positions, the table absorbs it all without complaint. It does not wobble too much. It does not collapse. It holds steady night after night, exactly as it has been asked to do. By the time you finish this portion of the meal, the table already feels familiar, like something you have known longer than just this evening. It is not memorable because it stands out, but because it does not. And as conversation remains sparse and chewing continues, The table quietly keeps its promise, supporting not just food, but the simple act of being together at the end of a long day. As the meal settles into a steady rhythm, you begin to notice something more subtle than smell or furniture. It is the quiet choreography of where bodies are placed. Who sits close to the hearth? Who claims the end of the table? Who balances on a bench rather than a chair? Nothing about it is announced yet. Nothing about it is accidental. You take your place without being told where to sit. Somehow you already know. Everyone does. The arrangement has been learned slowly through repetition, correction, and observation until it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like gravity. In many households of the 1700s America, the head of the family occupied a consistent position at the table, often nearest the fire or at one end. Surviving diaries and household descriptions suggest this placement was less about authority being displayed, and more about habit and efficiency. The warmest spot went to the person expected to eat the most and rise first if something needed attention. You notice how age shapes the layout. Older bodies tend to sit where standing up will be easier later. Younger ones adapt without complaint, folding themselves onto benches or stools. Children rarely question this. They learn early that seating is part of belonging, not a negotiation. A small but telling detail appears in several colonial letters. Guests were often offered a chair, even if family members remained on benches. The chair itself acted as a quiet signal of respect, not luxury. Comfort was secondary. Recognition mattered more. You glance down the table and realize how this arrangement manages conflict before it ever surfaces. People who tend to argue are not placed shoulder to shoulder. Those who share tasks sit closer, able to exchange short instructions without raising their voices. Even silence has geography here. One school of thought among social historians suggests that seating patterns functioned as informal governance. Without written rules or explicit discussion, families reinforced roles simply by returning to the same physical arrangement night after night. Authority, care, dependence, and expectation were all mapped onto the table. You sense that mapping now. The person closest to the bowls serves themselves first, then passes food along. Someone else waits without resentment, knowing their turn will come. Patience here is not virtuous, it is practical. Everyone understands the order. There is an oddly human moment when a child reaches for a seat that is not theirs. A pause follows, not sharp, not angry, just long enough to communicate correction. The child slides back to their usual place, cheeks warm, lesson learned without words. Tucked into a few household accounts is an amusing observation. Some families shifted seating slightly depending on the meal itself. If meat was present, the strongest eaters sat closest. If the meal was mostly grain or vegetables, placement mattered less. Hunger, not ceremony, dictated adjustment. You realize that this system also manages visibility. Those seated nearest the center of the table are seen more clearly in firelight. Their expressions, their pace of eating, their postural register. Those farther away exist more in shadow, allowed a certain quiet anonymity. There is still disagreement among historians about how rigid these arrangements truly were. Some evidence points to flexibility, especially in smaller households. Other records suggest deeply ingrained patterns that lasted decades. Sitting here, you can imagine both realities coexisting. Routine provides comfort, but necessity always has veto power. Your own body responds to the position you occupy. You lean when others lean. You pause when they pause. Seating shapes tempo. The meal moves at the speed set by whoever anchors the table, and everyone else adjusts without noticing they're doing so. The fire throws uneven light across faces now. Shadows deepen in the hollows of cheeks. Lines earned through years of work appear and disappear with each flicker. Sitting closer or farther from that light subtly alters how visible you are to the group. You notice how conversation follows seating. Short remarks travel easily between neighbours. Anything meant for the whole table waits until mouths pause together. There is no calling across the room. Distance dampens voice. An overlooked but fascinating point emerges in some recent scholarship. Seating may have offered one of the few daily moments when social hierarchy within a household was clearly visible to children. Long before they understood property or inheritance, they learned where they belonged, simply by where they sat. As you eat, you become aware that no one shifts seats casually. Standing up requires reason. Movement draws attention. Remaining in place signals contentment, or at least acceptance. Someone adjusts their position slightly to make room for another person arriving late. The shift is subtle, coordinated, without instruction. The pattern absorbs the change and restabilizes. No one comments. There is comfort in that stability. The table becomes a map you can trust. Even on days when food is thin or tempers short, the arrangement offers something predictable. It says you're part of this, whether you speak or not. A lesser-known anecdote from a frontier household describes a family who lost their table in a fire. When they rebuilt, they arranged themselves on the floor in the same order they had used at the table, unable or unwilling to abandon the pattern. Placement had become memory. You glance once more around the table and feel the weight of that repetition. Supper is not just nourishment. It is rehearsal. In Psalmwood, night after night, people practice being who they are to one another using the simplest tools available. As bowls empty and bodies settle deeper into their seats, the arrangement holds. No one rushes, no one disrupts the balance. And in that quiet order you feel how deeply these small decisions shape the rhythm of family life, carrying it gently forward into the rest of the evening. Once everyone is settled and the rhythm of eating has taken hold, you become aware of something else. It's not what is on the table, but what is not. There are no forks waiting patiently by each bowl, no neat rows of matching utensils. What you have instead is a small collection of tools, each one familiar, each one expected to work harder than its modern descendants. Your hands understand this before your mind does. You reach forward instinctively, fingers ready to pinch tear steady. Eating here is a physical act. It asks for participation. Records from the 1700s make this clear in an unremarkable way. Forks were rare in everyday American households, especially outside wealthy urban centers. Knives were common, spoons were shared, and hands filled in every gap. Utensils were personal items often carried rather than laid out. You notice a knife resting near one person's place. The handle is worn smooth, shaped by years of use. This knife does not belong to the table. It belongs to the person. It likely travelled with them during the day, cutting rope, trimming wood, doing whatever work was needed before turning to food. Bread becomes the first tool you use. You tear off a piece, feeling its density between your fingers. It is not airy. It resists slightly, then gives. Bread here is meant to hold up to dipping, scooping, wiping. It replaces both plate and utensil, absorbing broth, gathering bits that might otherwise be lost. A detail tucked into travellers' journals often surprises modern readers. Many visitors remarked on how skilled people were at eating without making a mess despite using their hands. Years of practice taught control. Fingers moved with precision, not carelessness. You dip bread into a bowl and lift it carefully, aware of gravity and balance. This is not rushed eating. It cannot be. Every motion matters. Spills mean waste, and waste is remembered. Someone nearby uses a spoon, dipping it, steadily returning it to the bowl without clatter. The spoon may serve 2 people tonight. When it changes hands, it is wiped quickly on bread or cloth. There is no embarrassment in this. Sharing tools is part of sharing food. There is an old household note that mentions children being taught to eat with restraint, not through lectures, but through imitation. They watched hands, they copied movements, manners were learned in silence. You notice how fingers pause between bites. Hands rest on the table, relaxed but alert. Eating is woven into conversation, not separated from it. When someone speaks, their hands often remain still, signalling attention before words do. Some scholars point out that this style of eating reinforced mindfulness. Without layers of utensils to create distance, people felt texture and temperature directly. Food announced itself clearly. Too hot meant waiting. Too rough meant chewing carefully. There is a small, almost humorous observation in one colonial letter. A visitor complained that his fingers were sore after supper, unused to the work required. The household found this amusing. Eating, like everything else, built strength over time. You become aware of how the lack of utensils changes posture. People lean closer to the table. Elbows come down naturally. The space between mouth and bowl shrinks. Eating is intimate, contained within a small radius of movement. A point of disagreement still exists among historians. Some argue that forks were avoided out of tradition and habit. Others suggest scarcity and cost played the larger role. Metal was valuable. Tools were expected to serve multiple purposes. Sitting here, it feels less like a choice and more like an adaptation that made sense. Your fingers brush against the table surface as you reach for another bite. Crumbs cling briefly, then fall away. You wipe your hands without thinking, a quick motion against fabric that has already seen far worse today. Children are watched closely, not for mess, but for waste. A dropped piece of bread draws a quiet look. Not anger, just awareness. Food is handled with respect because effort brought it here. There is an odd intimacy in shared tools. When the spoon moves from one person to another, it carries warmth. When the knife is passed, it is done handle first without discussion. These gestures repeat so often they fade into instinct. You notice that eating slows naturally. Without mechanical efficiency, meals take the time they need. Chewing is thorough, swallowing is unhurried. Fullness arrives gently, not all at once. In some modern interpretations, this way of eating is described as crude. That judgment misses something important. There is skill here. There is care. Hands know what they're doing. A lesser-known account from a rural household mentions that guests were sometimes offered a spoon of their own as a courtesy, even if family members shared. The gesture mattered. It acknowledged difference without changing the household's rhythm. As the meal continues, you find yourself less aware of the absence of utensils and more aware of presence. Your hands, the warmth of the bowl, the texture of food. Eating becomes something you feel fully, not something you perform automatically. There is quiet satisfaction in that. Nothing separates you from nourishment. No layers of metal. No rules spoken aloud. Just hands doing what they have learned to do over years of repetition. By the time you pause between bites, fingers, resting lightly on the table, the method no longer feels unusual. It feels right for this place, this moment, this kind of supper. And as the bowl empties and your hands grow still, you sense how deeply this physical way of eating ties people to their food, their labour, and one another, carrying the evening forward with grounded, unspoken understanding. As your hands rest for a moment, you realise how often they return to the same place. The bread. It sits near the centre of the table, close enough for everyone to reach without asking. No one guards it. No one counts slices. Its presence is assumed steady, reliable, almost architectural. You tear off another piece without thinking. The motion feels natural, practiced, as if your body remembers doing this long before your mind catches up. Bread here is not an accessory, it is the meal's backbone. Household records from the 1700s consistently show that bread or some form of baked grain appeared at nearly every supper regardless of wealth. Cornbread in some regions, rye or wheat in others, depending on climate and crops. Even when meat was scarce or vegetables, thin bread anchored the table. You feel its weight in your hand. This is not the light, airy bread of modern bakeries. It is dense, purposeful. It asks to be chewed slowly. It holds its shape when dipped. It fills space in the stomach and settles there warm and reassuring. Someone nearby breaks off a piece and uses it to wipe the bottom of their bowl, collecting the last traces of broth. Nothing is left behind. The bread makes sure of that. It turns remnants into sustenance. There is an odd little note found in several colonial cookbooks that speaks volumes. Bread recipes often focus less on flavour and more on yield. Instructions emphasise how to stretch grain, how to make loaves last, how to bake in ways that resist spoilage. Bread was not just food, it was strategy. You notice how people pace themselves with it. No one eats all their bread at once. Small pieces are torn off as needed, timed to the rest of the meal. Bread waits patiently like a reserve that will still be there later. The crust is firm beneath your fingers. The interior gives slightly when pressed. You imagine the hands that shaped it earlier today working dough with practiced pressure, knowing exactly when it was ready. Baking was not improvisation, it was routine refined through repetition. Some researchers suggest that bread carried emotional weight as well as nutritional value. The smell of baking often marked safety and continuity, especially in the uncertain times. Losing bread meant more than hunger, it meant disruption. You can sense that reverence in the way it is handled. Bread is never thrown. Even crumbs are brushed together and eaten or saved. Waste would feel wrong here, almost disrespectful. A curious anecdote from a frontier settlement describes a family who ran out of nearly everything one winter except cornmeal. Supper became little more than variations of bread. No one complained. Bread, it seemed, was enough to keep morale intact. You take another bite and feel how it slows you down. Chewing takes time. That time creates space. Conversation pauses naturally. Breathing deepens. Bread sets the tempo of the meal as much as the fire does. There remains some disagreement among historians about how monotonous diets truly were in early America. Some accounts emphasize repetition and lack of variety. Others point to seasonal shifts and regional creativity. Bread sits at the center of that debate, constant yet adaptable. Here at the table, it feels less like monotony and more like grounding. Bread does not compete for attention. It supports everything else quietly. A child reaches too far, fingers grazing another hand. There is no scolding. The bread is passed closer. Sharing it requires no words. Its position at the table invites cooperation. You notice that bread also fills gaps. When someone finishes their portion early, bread extends the meal. When someone eats slowly, bread waits. It accommodates different rhythms without complaint. In some households, bread was broken by the eldest or the head of the family, not as ceremony but as habit. That act reinforced continuity. The same hand, the same motion night after night. You feel how bread connects the day's labour to this moment. Grain planted, tended, harvested, ground, mixed, baked. Each step leads here. Holding it, you are holding time compressed into something edible. There is a softness in that realization. Bread carries effort without advertising it. It arrives at the table ready to be consumed, not praised. You use it again to gather the last bits from your bowl. The bread absorbs flavor, becoming something slightly different with each bite. It changes as the meal changes, adapting without losing its identity. Some modern writers romanticize bread as symbol. Others reduce it to calories. Sitting here, it feels like both ideas miss the point. Bread is not metaphor, it is presence. You glance around the table and see how often hands return to it. Even when conversation stirs or someone shifts in their seat, bread remains the constant touch point. As the meal progresses, the pile grows smaller, but it never quite disappears. Someone has judged the amount carefully. Enough for now, enough to last. By the time you feel full, bread has done most of the work. It has steadied hunger, slowed eating, softened edges. It has made the rest of the meal possible. And as you brush crumbs from your fingers and rest your hands again, you sense that this simple food holds the evening together quietly and completely, preparing the way for whatever comes next at the table. As the bread diminishes and bowls are passed back and forth, something else quietly enters the room. It is rarer, heavier. It changes the way people sit up just a little straighter. Meat has appeared. You do not see large portions. There is no dramatic carving moment. Instead, small pieces are distributed carefully, as if everyone understands this is not the main body of the meal, but an accent to it. A bit of salt pork, a strip of smoked meat, perhaps a piece of dried beef softened by a long cooking. Whatever it is, it carries weight beyond its size. Household account books from the 18th century make this clear in a practical way. Meat was eaten far less frequently than modern diets would suggest, especially in ordinary families. Livestock represented stored value. Animals were walked, fed, and guarded for months or years before becoming food. When meat reached the table, it meant something had been deliberately given up. You notice how the pieces are shared. No one takes more than their portion without hesitation. Eyes track the bowl not greedily but attentively. Meat here is not consumed casually, it's acknowledged through care. You lift your piece and feel the resistance as you bite. It is not tender in the modern sense, your teeth work for it. Chewing takes time. Flavour unfolds slowly, salt first, then smoke, then something deeper that feels almost earthy. There is a small observation tucked into several period letters that speaks volumes. People often described meat not by taste, but by how long it lasted. Salted pork that could stretch through winter. Smoked beef that held through damp weather. Longevity mattered more than delicacy. You sense that mindset at the table now. Meat is eaten deliberately paired with bread stretched across multiple bites. Someone uses a piece of bread to collect the fat left behind, ensuring none of it disappears into the bowl unused. Children are watched more closely when meat is present, not with suspicion, but with instruction. A gentle reminder to chew carefully, a quiet correction if fingers move too quickly. Meat requires respect. Some researchers suggest that meat functioned as a social signal within the household. Its presence could mark a successful hunt, a good season, or a moment worth acknowledging. Other scholars caution against over-symbolizing it, pointing out that practicality often outweighed meaning. Sitting here, you feel how both ideas coexist. Meat is meaningful precisely because it is practical. The fire pops softly as someone adjusts a log. Light glances off the surface of the meat briefly, then disappears as shadows shift. Everything about this moment feels contained inward-facing, almost private. You notice how conversation changes. Words slow, mouths stay busy longer. Meat quiets the table without being asked to. Eating becomes the focus, again pulling attention back to the bowl and the hand. An unusual detail emerges in some rural accounts. In households with limited meat, the cooking liquid itself carried much of the flavour. The meat flavoured the broth, which then flavoured the bread. Even when meat portions were tiny, its influence spread. You experience that now. The broth tastes fuller than it did earlier. Bread dipped into it carries a faint echo of meat, allowing everyone to share in its presence, even if the pieces themselves are small. There is still disagreement among historians about how often ordinary families truly ate meat. Some argue it was a rare treat. Others suggest it appeared more regularly, though in small amounts. The truth likely varied by region, season, and circumstance. At this table, the exact frequency matters less than the care with which it is handled tonight. You finish your portion slowly, almost reluctantly, aware that once it is gone, it is gone. No one reaches for seconds without pausing. The bowl is passed again lighter now. A child licks their fingers before remembering themselves and wiping their hand on cloth. No one scolds. Hunger makes allowances. You notice that meat leaves a lingering presence even after it is eaten. The smell remains faintly in the air. The taste stays on the tongue, it changes the rest of the meal by its absence. As the bowl is set aside, bread and vegetables return to prominence. The table relaxes slightly. Shoulders drop, eating resumes its earlier rhythm. Meat has done its work, it has added richness mark the meal, and then quietly stepped back. There was no celebration, no announcement. Just a shared understanding that something valuable has passed through the room. As you wipe your fingers and reach again for bread, you feel how this careful balance shapes supper itself. Enough to nourish, enough to remember, never enough to forget where it came from. And as the evening continues, the memory of meat lingers softly folded into the larger rhythm of the meal, reminding you that even small portions can carry deep meaning when effort and restraint meet at the table. With the meat now gone, and the bread doing quieter work, your attention drifts to what remains steady in the bowls. Vegetables. They do not announce themselves, they simply continue dependable and familiar, carrying the season into the room without needing explanation. You notice the colours first muted but distinct in the firelight. Pale roots softened by heat. Dark greens dulled by long cooking. Everything looks practical, shaped by what could survive storage and travel, rather than what might impress. These vegetables are not chosen for novelty. They are chosen because they endure. Accounts from farms and households across 1700s America consistently point to vegetables as daily staples. Turnips, onions, beans, cabbages, squash, and whatever else could be grown locally filled most bowls most nights. Meat might come and go, but vegetables stayed. You lift a spoonful and feel how yielding it is. Long cooking has done its work. The texture is soft enough to mash against the roof of your mouth, easing the work of chewing after a tiring day. This food understands fatigue. The taste is honest, earth-forward, slightly sweet in places, faintly bitter in others. Salt, if present, has been applied with care. Too much would overwhelm, too little would leave the dish flat. Someone learned this balance long ago and passed it down quietly. A revealing detail shows up in many kitchen notes from the period. Recipes were often vague by modern standards, offering guidance rather than instruction. Phrases like cook until done or season to taste appear frequently. Cooks relied on experience and senses rather than precise measures. You sense that confidence here. No one checks the bowl anxiously. No one wonders if it turned out right. Vegetables cooked this way are forgiving. They absorb flavor. They adjust. As you eat, you realize how clearly the season speaks through these dishes. In winter, roots dominate. In spring, stored grains stretch to meet the first greens. In summer, freshness briefly takes over. Tonight's vegetables tell you exactly where you are in the year without anyone saying a word. There is an amusing observation tucked into a few travelers' journals. Some visitors complain that colonial meals tasted the same day after day. Others marveled at how small changes marked time. The difference, it seems, depended on whether one was paying attention. You begin to pay attention now. A slight sweetness hints at squash harvested months ago and stored carefully. A sharper note suggests cabbage fermented or cooked long enough to tame it. Each bite carries a small clue. Vegetables also carry memory. The same fields, the same garden beds, the same hands pulling and washing and cutting. Eating them connects the table back to the land in a way nothing else quite does. Not all historians agree on how much variety households enjoyed. Some argue diets were monotonous by necessity. Others point to regional diversity and seasonal rotation as evidence of more complexity. Sitting here, you sense how repetition and variation coexist. The ingredients repeat, but the combinations shift. Children eat vegetables without protest, not because they love them, but because they are normal. This is what supper tastes like. There is no expectation of alternatives. Taste is shaped by exposure, and exposure has been consistent. You notice how vegetables are shared more freely than meat was earlier. Bowls move easily. Portions are adjusted casually. There is less watchfulness. Vegetables are abundant relative to everything else. A small but telling detail emerges in household advice manuals of the era. Cooks were encouraged to stretch vegetables by cutting them smaller, cooking them longer, and pairing them with bread. Fullness mattered more than presentation. You experience that strategy now. Bread and vegetables work together seamlessly. The bread absorbs juices. The vegetables soften the bread. Neither tries to dominate. There is a quiet satisfaction in this balance. It does not aim to excite. It aims to sustain. You pause between bites and notice how the room feels steadier than it did earlier. Hunger has receded. The sharp focus on food has softened. Vegetables seem to encourage that transition, guiding the meal from urgency toward ease. Someone reaches for the bowl and finds it nearly empty. They scrape the last spoonful without embarrassment and pass it along anyway. The bowl returns with a faint sheen evidence of a job well done. There remains some uncertainty among scholars about how often fresh vegetables appeared versus preserved ones. Cellars, pickling and drying extended availability, but not perfectly. Tonight's mix suggests careful planning rather than chance. You sense the planning in every bite. Someone thought ahead. Someone saved seed. Someone stored enough. Supper reflects months of quiet decisions. As the vegetables diminish, their absence feels different from the meats. There is no sense of loss, just completion. They have done their work thoroughly. You rest your spoon and lean back slightly, aware that the hardest part of the meal is over. What remains will move more slowly now. Vegetables, steady and unassuming, have carried the table from hunger into comfort. They have spoken of weather soil, patience, and planning without raising their voice. And as the bowls empty and the evening deepens, you feel how these simple foods root the family in place and time, marking the season gently as supper continues its quiet glide toward night. As the bowls settle back into their places and hands pause between bites, your awareness of it drifts toward the hearth. The fire has been present all along, but now it asserts itself more clearly, not through sound or light alone, but through influence. It controls the room in ways that feel both subtle and absolute. The heat reaches you unevenly. One side of your body warms while the other remains cool. You shift without thinking, angling your chair just enough to catch a little more comfort. Everyone does this eventually. The fire invites constant quiet negotiation. Descriptions from the period make one thing unmistakable. In 1700s American homes, the hearth was the centre of domestic life. Cooking, heating, lighting, and even social gathering revolved around it. There was no way to separate supper from the fire that made it possible. You notice how the meal has unfolded at the fire's pace. Nothing arrived quickly. Nothing was rushed. Stews thickened slowly. Vegetables softened over hours. Bread baked according to heat that had to be managed by feel rather than dial. Supper here cannot move faster than the fire allows. Someone rises briefly to adjust a log. The movement is practiced economical. A poker nudges embers into a better arrangement. Sparks jump, then settle. The person returns to their seat without comment, as if this was simply another bite taken. A small but revealing note appears in many household guides from the era. Managing a fire was considered a skilled task often taught deliberately. Knowing how to coax steady heat without wasting fuel was as important as knowing how to cook itself. You can sense that expertise in the way the room feels. The fire is not roaring, it is not dying. It sits in a careful balance, warm enough to comfort, controlled enough to trust. The fire also shapes time. As it burns lower, the evening advances. People glance at it unconsciously, reading its state the way you might check a clock. When the flames dip, the meal begins to wind down. When embers glow steadily, conversation feels safe to linger. Some historians suggest that fire management influenced social behaviour more than we often realise. Without artificial light, the hearth dictated when people gathered, when they rested, and when they slept. Supper fit neatly into that rhythm. You feel the truth of that now. The firelight pulls attention inward. Shadows deepen beyond the table, narrowing the world to what sits within reach. Outside concerns fade with the daylight. There is an odd observation recorded by a traveller in the mid-18th century. He noted that families seemed calmer in the evening than at any other time, attributing it to the fire's presence. Warmth, he wrote, softened tempers as much as bodies. You watch how faces change in the flicker. Lines soften, expressions slow. Firelight forgives harshness, smoothing features and quieting movement. It invites stillness without demanding it. The fire also dictates where people sit. Those who feel the cold most keenly gravitate closer. Others, already warm from work or younger in body, tolerate the edges. Placement around the hearth is fluid, responsive to need. There remains debate among scholars about how consistently fires were kept burning through the night. Some argue fuel scarcity forced fires to be banked or extinguished. Others point to evidence of low-guarded embers maintained until morning. Tonight at least, the fire is meant to last through supper. You notice how food interacts with heat even now. Steam lifts differently as bowls cool. Bread stiffens slightly at the edges. The meal changes as the fire shifts, reminding you that eating is tied to temperature as much as taste. A child edges closer to the hearth drawn by warmth. An adult gently steers them back, not sharply, just enough. Fire is comfort, but it is also danger. That awareness hums beneath every movement. The room carries the sound of fire constantly, a soft crackle that fills gaps between words. Silence never feels empty when the hearth is active, it breathes for the household. You realise that the fire has shaped not just this meal space, but the entire day that led to it. Wood was gathered earlier, kindling was prepared, someone tended the flame through cooking so that supper could exist at all. That effort is invisible now, folded into the comfort of warmth. No one thanks the fire. No one needs to. Its presence is assumed like the table or the bread. As the meal slows and bowls empty further, the fire becomes the focus again. People lean back slightly, letting warmth reach their backs. The urgency of hunger has passed. What remains is quiet satisfaction. Firelight dances across the table, catching crumbs, highlighting the grain of wood, then slipping away. Everything feels temporary and continuous at once. You sense that when the fire is eventually banked lower, the evening will move naturally toward rest. Supper will end, not with an announcement, but with a cooling. And for now, as the flames hold steady and the household settles into that warmth, you understand how deeply the fire governs the pace of eating, the shape of conversation, and the gentle unwinding of the day into night. As the warmth settles and the fire's work becomes quieter, your attention shifts toward the smaller movements around the table. Children are still here, very much part of the meal, but in a way that feels different from modern expectations. Their presence is steady, woven into the scene without becoming its centre. You notice how they eat. Not hurried, not indulged. They follow the rhythm set by the adults, learning it simply by being here. No separate table, no special food. Supper is shared, and so is its pace. In many families during the 1700s, children ate the same meals as adults as soon as they were able to manage adults' solid food. There were no simplified menus designed just for them. Surviving household notes suggest that children adapted early to whatever the household could provide, their tastes shaped by repetition, rather than choice. A younger child fidgets, legs swinging under the bench feet, brushing the wood in a soft, irregular pattern. The sound is barely noticed. Movement like this is expected. Children are allowed to exist as long as they do not disrupt the flow. When a child speaks, it is often in response to a direct question or a task. Fetch this, pass that. Words are practical here. Long explanations are rare. Instruction happens through watching more than telling. You see a child pause mid-bite, eyes following an adult's hand as it moves bread across the table. The child mirrors the motion a moment later, slightly clumsier, but clearly trying. Learning happens in these quiet echoes. There is a small observation tucked into a minister's journal from the period. He noted that children seemed to learn patience at the table before they learned it anywhere else. Waiting for food, waiting for turns, waiting for adults to finish speaking all taught restraint without formal lessons. You sense that restraint now. When a bowl runs low, children glance up before reaching again. Not out of fear, but awareness. They understand that resources are shared and that awareness shapes behaviour early. Not everyone studying family life in this era agrees on how strict these expectations were. Some accounts describe affectionate indulgence. Others emphasize discipline and silence. What feels clear here is balance. Children are neither invisible nor indulged. They're included, guided, and expected to adapt. A child drops a piece of bread. It lands on the floor with a dull sound. For a moment, nothing happens. Then an adult bends, retrieves it, brushes it clean, and returns it to the child without comment. Waste is corrected quietly without shame. You notice that children eat more solely than adults now, not because they are less hungry, but because they are watching. Each bite is a chance to learn. Where to place hands, how to share space, when to pause. There is an odd little detail mentioned in several colonial letters. Children were often expected to finish what was on their plate, not as punishment, but because portions were already modest. Leftovers were planned, not accidental. Finishing mattered. You see that expectation gently enforced. A child who lingers too long is nudged with a look, not a word. The message is simple. Eat. This food matters. Conversation skirts around the children rather than through them. Adult concerns are not hidden, but they are softened. Topics remain close to the household, the weather, the work ahead. Children absorb more than anyone realizes. You realize how this shapes memory. Supper becomes one of the few times children hear adult voices at rest. Not commanding, not instructing, just present. Those tones linger long after specific words fade. A less discussed but important point emerges from some recent interpretations. The supper table may have been one of the primary spaces where children learned social order not through rules but through placement, timing, and tone. As the meal continues, children grow quieter, not because they are told to, but because fullness and warmth do their work. Shoulders slump slightly, movements slow, hunger gives way to comfort. You feel how normal this all seems to those living it. There is no sense of childhood being protected from reality. Instead, childhood is folded into it, gently shaped by repetition and example. As bowls empty and as tension drifts, children begin to fade from the center of the room, not leaving, just becoming part of the background again. They have eaten, they have learned, they have belonged. And as the fire continues its steady breathing and the adults settle deeper into their seats, you sense how these quiet evenings build habits that last far beyond the table, teaching children not just how to eat, but how to move through a shared world with awareness and restraint. As the children quiet and the bowls grow lighter, something else settles over the table. Silence. Not the awkward kind that begs to be filled, but a thick, familiar quiet that feels earned. It drapes itself across the room the way warmth does without asking permission. You notice how no one rushes to speak. Mouths stay busy, hands move steadily, breathing becomes more audible. The fire carries most of the sound now, its low crackle stitching the room together. Silence here is not a pause between conversations, it's part of the meal itself. Letters and journals from the 18th century hint at this often. Supper was not always a time for storytelling or debate. After a full day of labour, many families ate in near-quiet, conserving energy and letting food do its work. Talk was optional, not expected. You feel that permission now. The absence of chatter does not signal tension or distance. It signals familiarity. Everyone knows where they stand. Nothing needs clarifying in this moment. Someone chews slowly, eyes lowered. Another person stares into the bowl as if thinking about nothing at all. Silence gives room for thoughts to wander without demanding they be shared. There is a small, almost humorous detail buried in a New England diary. A visitor once complained that a family's supper felt uncomfortably quiet, only to learn later that this was considered polite. Talking too much while eating was thought to distract from the work of nourishment. You understand that logic now. Eating requires attention here. Bones must be avoided, hot food respected, shared tools navigated carefully. Silence makes space for that awareness. When words do appear, they arrive gently. A short comment about tomorrow's weather. A reminder about a task waiting at dawn. These remarks do not interrupt the quiet. They pass through it and dissolve. You notice how silence allows other sounds to surface. The scrape of a spoon. The soft thud of bread torn in half. A chair shifting as someone adjusts their weight. These noises feel amplified yet comforting. Some researchers suggest that this kind of quiet helped regulate emotion within households. Without constant talk, tempers had fewer sparks to catch. Silence smoothed edges after long demanding days. Others are less convinced, pointing out that quiet could also mask unspoken tensions. Both ideas may be true. Sitting here, the silence feels neutral, shaped more by fatigue than feeling. A child clears their throat softly, then thinks better of speaking. The moment passes without consequence. Silence does not punish curiosity, it simply absorbs it. You realize that modern expectations often frame silence as absence. Here it feels like presence. Everyone is aware of everyone else without needing to announce it. The fire pops once louder than before. Several heads lift briefly, then settle again when nothing follows. Attention is shared easily, even in quiet. An overlooked detail in household manuals of the era suggests that speaking while chewing was discouraged, not as a moral issue, but a practical one. Food was often tough, distraction could mean choking, silence again served safety. You find your own body adapting. Your breathing slows, your movements grow smaller. Without conversation to track your senses widen. You notice warmth on your face, cool air at your back, the weight of the bowl in your hands. Silence also marks time. Without words to break it, minutes stretch gently. The meal feels longer, fuller, more complete. No one feels rushed to finish. Someone sighs quietly, a sound halfway between breath and relief. It carries no message beyond comfort. There is still debate among historians about how much of daily life unfolded in silence versus speech. Records capture words more easily than quiet. What goes unwritten often mattered just as much. Tonight's silence feels like agreement. Agreement that the day is done. Agreement that the work has been enough. Agreement that for this stretch of time, nothing more is required. As the meal winds on and the fire burns lower, the quiet deepens rather than lifts. It holds the household together, allowing everyone to rest without leaving the table. And as you sit within it, spoon-resting hands warm, you sense how this shared silence is not emptiness at all, but a gentle fullness, one that carries the evening forward with calm, steady assurance. The silence loosens just enough for something familiar to surface, not a speech, not a sermon, just the soft presence of belief. Religion does not arrive loudly at this table. It lingers woven into habit, posture and timing rather than words. You notice it in what happens before the first bite and after the last. A pause that is slightly longer than necessary. A bowed head held just a moment more. A hand resting flat on the table as if to steady thought as much as body. In many households across 1700s America, some form of religious acknowledgement framed the meal, even when spoken prayer was brief or absent. Faith was not always announced. It was assumed folded into routine like bread and fire. You feel how belief here is practical. It does not float above the meal. It sits inside it. Gratitude is expressed through restraint, through finishing what is taken, through not wasting what has been provided. Someone murmurs a short phrase under their breath. It is not meant to be heard clearly. Others do not respond. The words are not a performance. They are an offering made quietly and accepted without comment. There is a revealing detail in several personal letters from the period. Some people worried less about saying the correct prayer than about maintaining the correct attitude. Reverence, they believed, showed itself in behaviour more than language. You sense that attitude now. No one complains about the food. No one compares this meal to another. Supper is approached with a seriousness that feels calm rather than heavy. Religion also shapes what is not on the table. Certain foods avoided on certain days. Portions adjusted according to belief. The meal bends gently around these boundaries without friction. Children watch these moments closely. They may not understand the words, but they understand the pause. The quiet carries meaning even before meaning has a name. There is an odd little anecdote recorded by a visiting schoolmaster. He noted that some families prayed aloud only when guests were present, preferring silence when alone. Faith for them was personal before it was public. You notice how belief does not interrupt eating. It does not demand attention beyond a brief moment. Once acknowledged, it steps aside, allowing the meal to continue. Some historians suggest that supper served as one of the most consistent daily expressions of faith, more regular than church attendance for many. Others caution that practice varied widely depending on denomination, region and household temperament. Sitting here variation feels natural. Faith adapts to circumstance. You feel how religion at this table is less about doctrine and more about rhythm. The same motions repeated night after night. The same pause, the same quiet respect. A child begins to speak too soon and stops sensing the moment has not quite passed. No one corrects them. The boundary is learned through presence, not enforcement. The fire shifts again, embers settling lower. Light dims slightly. The moment passes without announcement and eating resumes fully. You realise how belief here is not separate from survival. Gratitude is not abstract. It is directed toward food that took effort to grow, harvest, prepare and protect. Faith is anchored to labour. There is a gentleness to that understanding. No one expects perfection. No one expects constant devotion. What matters is acknowledgement, however brief. As the bowls empty further and the room relaxes, the sense of religion fades back into the background. It does not linger heavily. It has done its work. You feel how this quiet framing shapes the emotional tone of supper. It encourages humility without demanding submission. It invites patience without enforcing silence. Religion here does not ask you to look upward. It asks you to look around the table and recognize interdependence. As hands rest and breathing slows, you sense how these small repeated acts build a worldview without speeches or lessons. They've become something lived rather than explained. And as the meal continues its slow drift toward completion, belief remains present but unobtrusive, like the warmth of the fire or the weight of the bread, steady, familiar, and gently grounding as the evening deepens. As the meal settles into its second half, attention turns almost without thinking to what people are drinking. Cups are lifted more often now, throats clear, mouths feel dry from bread and salt. The liquid matters not as a luxury but as reassurance. You lift your cup and notice its weight. It is heavier than expected, thick-walled, made to survive drops and rough handling. The rim is worn smooth. Many lips have met it before yours. The drink inside is not water. It rarely is. What fills the cup is mild, cloudy, faintly sweet or sour depending on the day. Small beer, cider, something fermented just enough to be safer than what runs in streams and wells nearby. Household records and tavern accounts from the 18th century quietly confirm this reality. Fermented drinks were consumed daily by adults and children alike, not for intoxication, but because the brewing process made them safer to drink than untreated water in many places. You take a sip and feel how gentle it is. There is no sharp burn, no heady rush, just enough flavour to refresh the mouth and ease swallowing. This drink is meant to accompany work and food, not interrupt them. A child reaches for a cup and is allowed a small portion without comment. No one treats this as remarkable. The drink is weak enough to be considered food as much as beverage. It hydrates and nourishes at once. There is an amusing note in a traveller's diary describing his surprise at seeing children drink beer with supper. The family was equally surprised by his concern. To them, this was simply how one stayed healthy. You notice how the drink changes the pace of the meal. Bites are followed by sips, chewing slows, salt softens. The cup becomes part of the rhythm, lifted and set down in time with the fire's breathing. Some historians caution against assuming that all colonial water was unsafe. In certain regions and seasons, clean sources existed. Others point out how inconsistent purity could be, especially near settlements. What feels certain here is preference. Fermented drinks are trusted. You swirl the cup slightly and see sediment shift at the bottom. No one minds this. Clarity is not a priority. Reliability is. There is also a social function at work. Passing cups, refilling them, noticing when someone's is empty, all provide small opportunities for care. These gestures replace conversation when words are scarce. A small detail tucked into household advice literature mentions that drinks were often served after food had begun, not before. Liquid was meant to assist digestion, not dull appetite. You sense that timing now. Drinking earlier might have filled space needed for food. Drinking now supports completion. As the cup warms in your hand, the drink inside tastes slightly different. Fermentation continues quietly. Nothing here is static. Everything moves slowly. Everything. Not everyone agrees on how much alcohol people actually consumed in daily life during this period. Some estimates run high. Others suggest moderation was more common at home than in taverns. Sitting here, moderation feels plausible. No one drinks quickly, no one reaches for more than needed. You notice how drink allows conversation to surface again gently. A short comment. A question answered with a nod. Liquid loosens the edges of silence without breaking it. The cups themselves tell stories. Chips along the base. Hairline cracks sealed long ago. These vessels have survived drops, freezes, and hurried washing. They are trusted tools, not decorations. You rest your cup and feel warmth spread from your hand into your chest. The drink does its work quietly. It settles food. It steadies mood. A child yawns and leans closer to the table cup, forgotten for the moment. Evening is advancing. Drink marks that passage as clearly as firelight does. As cups empty and are refilled one last time, the meal begins its slow descent toward closure. Drinking tapers off naturally. Thirst is answered. No one lingers over the cup for pleasure alone. You realize how essential this simple drink has been. It made eating easier. It made sharing smoother. It carried trust. And as you set the cup aside and wipe your mouth, you feel how this small ordinary act completes the meal's balance. Leaving the table, calm bodies satisfied and the household ready to drift further into the quiet of night. As cups are set down and the table grows less crowded with dishes, you begin to sense the weight of work that made this meal possible. It does not announce itself. No one lists tasks or claims credit. Yet it hums quietly beneath everything, especially around the person who prepared the food. You notice her hands first. Not idle now, but finally at rest. Fingers slightly swollen from the day nails worn short skin marked by heat and water and grain. These hands have already done their share long before supper began. Much of what we know about household labour in the 1700s comes from letters, account books and advice manuals, and together they point to one steady truth. Meal preparation required hours of planning and physical effort, most of it unseen by those who arrived hungry at the table. You replay the day backward in your mind. The fire lit early and kept alive, water hauled, vegetables washed, trimmed, cut, dough mixed and shaped, meat managed, carefully salted or soaked or simmered just long enough. None of it happened quickly. She eats now, but not with the same hunger as others. Her bites are smaller, her attention still half-tuned to the room. Even seated, she remains alert, ready to rise if something spills or a child needs correction. There is a revealing note in a mid-century household guide that advises women to eat last when possible, so that others may be served without interruption. It presents this not as sacrifice, but as good management. Supper, like everything else, required overbite. You sense that mindset here. Eating is only one task among many. Satisfaction comes not just from fullness, but from seeing the household settled. A child asks quietly if there is more bread. She nods and passes it without breaking her own rhythm. No sigh, no comment. This exchange has happened hundreds of times before. Some modern readers assume this labour was resented or resisted. Others argue it was accepted as identity bound tightly to responsibility and skill. The truth likely shifts from person to person, day to day. Tonight, what you feel is not resentment, but endurance. The work does not end with the last bite. Even now she is already thinking ahead. What can be saved? What must be cleaned immediately? What can wait until morning? An unusual detail tucked into a colonial diary mentions a woman who measured the success of a meal not by praise, but by how little attention it drew. If no one complained, if no one noticed gaps, the supper had done its job. That quiet standard hangs in the room now. No compliments have been spoken, none are needed. The absence of disruption is the reward. You notice that others begin to slow, leaning back slightly, hands resting. She remains forward, attentive, as if waiting for permission to relax. It will come, but not yet. The labour behind supper also extends beyond cooking. Dishes must be washed, scraps sorted, ashes managed, water reheated if needed. Even rest is structured around what still needs doing. Some historians question whether women of the period viewed this work as central to family life or simply unavoidable. Written records rarely capture emotion clearly. What survives instead is repetition. The same tasks, the same timing, the same expectations. You feel the weight of that repetition now. Supper is not an isolated event. It is one link in a long chain of care that stretches across days and years. As the room grows quieter, she finally takes a deeper breath. Her shoulders drop a fraction. The household has reached a stable point. That is her signal. She eats the last of her bread slowly, savouring not just the taste, but the moment of stillness. This pause may be brief, but it is real. You realise how invisible this labour becomes once it works well. When food arrives on time and enough is shared, the effort behind it dissolves into normalcy. And as the evening continues to soften around the table, you feel a quiet respect settle in. Supper has nourished bodies, but it has also demonstrated a kind of steady devotion, one expressed not through words, but through work done so consistently that it almost disappears. As the person who prepared the meal finally settles back, you notice another shift at the table. The posture of the men changes, subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders ease, backs straighten and then soften. The kind of hunger that comes from long hours of physical work has been answered at least enough for the moment. You feel it in the way they eat. Portions are steady, unhurried, but purposeful. These are bodies that have burned through calories since dawn. Fields, forests, workshops, animals, fences. Labour that leaves a mark not just on muscles, but on appetite itself. Farm records and wage logs from the 1700s quietly reflect this reality. Men engaged in agricultural or manual trades required far more daily calories than most people today. Supper was not indulgence. It was refueling essential for facing the same demands again tomorrow. You notice how bread disappears fastest near them. Hands return again and again, tearing, dipping, wiping bowls clean. There is no embarrassment in this. Hunger earned through work carries no shame. Someone leans forward, elbows on the table, now finally allowing themselves to rest. Another shifts in their chair, testing how their body feels after food. These movements signal relief more than comfort. There is an interesting aside recorded in several rural letters. Men sometimes judged a meal less by flavour and more by how long it kept them full. A supper that carried them through the night and into the next morning was considered a good one regardless of variety. You sense that evaluation happening silently now. Bites are assessed not consciously but bodily. Stomachs begin to settle, the sharp edge of hunger fades, muscles loosen just a little. Conversation, when it comes, often circles around work. Not complaints, just facts. What needs doing tomorrow? What was finished today? These exchanges are brief, efficient, and then allowed to fade again. Some historians caution against assuming men were always served first or favoured at the table. Evidence suggests practices varied widely by household and circumstance. What feels clear here is function. Those who expended the most energy needed the most replenishment. You notice how others at the table accommodate this without comment. Bowls are passed toward them more often. Bread is nudged closer. These gestures are not acts of deference so much as recognition of need. A child watches this, quietly absorbing another lesson. Work shapes appetite. Appetite shapes portions. Nothing is random. There is a small but telling detail in one account from a frontier settlement. A man described eating until his body told him to stop, not until food ran out. Listening to hunger cues was practical when supplies had to last. You feel that awareness now. No one overeats for pleasure. Eating ends when fullness arrives, not when the table is cleared. As plates empty, the men begin to lean back slightly, hands resting on stomachs or folded loosely. This posture signals completion. The work of eating is done. The fire's warmth reaches them now more fully. Earlier hunger demanded focus. Now warmth and rest take over. The transition is almost visible. You sense how supper acts as a hinge in the day. Before it, effort dominates. After it, endurance gives way to recovery. Men who were tense hours ago now allow themselves to soften. There is still debate among scholars about how much emotional expression was permitted or expected from men in domestic spaces during this period. Written sources often emphasize restraint, yet moments like this suggest a quieter range of feeling expressed through posture rather than words. A man exhales slowly, a sound halfway between breath and satisfaction. No one remarks on it. The sound is enough. As the table settles into this calmer phase, you realize how supper has done more than feed bodies. It has reset them, prepared them for rest, made the next day possible. And as the men grow quieter, their hunger finally eased. You feel the balance of the household reassert itself. Labour answered by food, effort met with care, supper fulfilling its role as the bridge between work and rest, carrying everyone gently toward the night ahead. You sense the change the moment an extra presence settles into the room. It does not matter whether the guest arrived earlier in the day or just before supper. Their existence alters the shape of the table in ways both obvious and subtle. A chair is pulled closer. A bench shifts. Someone gives up a familiar spot without being asked. The table stretches itself to accommodate another body, another appetite, another set of eyes, observing how things are done here. You feel the shift in the air. Conversation, sparse as it has been, becomes slightly more deliberate. Bites are taken with a touch more care. Hands wipe more often on cloth. Supper becomes aware of itself. In households across colonial America, guests were common, sometimes expected, often unavoidable. Travel was slow distances long, and hospitality functioned as a social necessity rather than a courtesy. When someone arrived near evening, feeding them was assumed even if it strained supplies. You notice how food is redistributed quietly. Portions are adjusted without comment. Bread is broken into smaller pieces. Vegetables are spread more thinly. No one announces scarcity. Everyone understands it. There is an old account from a coastal settlement describing a family who entertained unexpected visitors 3 nights in a row, stretching one pot of stew further each evening. The writer noted not the inconvenience, but the skill involved in making enough appear from almost nothing. You see that skill at work now. Bowls circulate more carefully. Serving spoons pours measure by feel rather than sight. Someone takes slightly less than usual eyes, flicking toward the guest before returning to their bowl. The guest, for their part, eats with restraint. They do not reach feet first, they wait. Their posture mirrors gratitude without words. Being fed here is an exchange, not a transaction. You notice that a chair, not a bench, has been offered. The chair carries meaning. It signals welcome and respect. It acknowledges difference without drawing attention to it. Some interpretations of early American hospitality emphasize generosity as moral duty. Others frame it as survival strategy. Neighbors helped neighbors because isolation demanded it. Sitting here, the line between duty and strategy feels thin. Hospitality sustains reputation and community at the same time. Conversation opens slightly. Questions are asked that would not surface on an ordinary night. Where did you come from? How long will you stay? The answers are brief, careful not to dominate the meal. Children watch closely. Guests offer lessons by example. How much to eat, how long to wait, how to accept without imposing. These are not taught outright. They are absorbed. A curious detail from a Pennsylvania farm journal mentions that some families kept a small reserve of food specifically for guests hidden from daily use. Not to hoard, but to ensure dignity when surprise arrived. Supper with a guest carried its own expectations. You sense that reserve being tapped now. Perhaps not physically, but emotionally. Patience increases, tolerance widens. The household stretches just enough to include someone new. The presence of a guest also softens boundaries. Silence becomes lighter. Smiles appear more often brief and understated. The table holds both familiarity and formality at once. Not everyone agrees on how welcome guests truly were in households already strained by labour and limited resources. Some letters express frustration, others describe pride. Tonight what you feel is resolve. Feeding another person is hard, but it is also clarifying. As the meal continues, the guest begins to relax. Shoulders drop, eating slows. The fear of taking too much eases as reassurance arrives through gesture rather than speech. You notice how the fire is tended a little more attentively. Light matters more when someone unfamiliar sits at the table. Seeing faces clearly feels important. A bowl empties sooner than expected. There is a brief pause, then someone passes bread instead. The substitution is seamless, no one comments, adaptation is second nature. You realize that guests experience the household differently than family members do. Every detail becomes information. Seating, portions, tone. Supper teaches them who these people are. At the same time, the household becomes aware of itself through the guest's eyes. The familiar feels newly visible. Habits surface. As plates empty and fullness settles in, the guest offers a quiet word of thanks. It is brief and sincere. It lands gently accepted without ceremony. The meal winds down more slowly tonight. Guests lengthen evenings, stories may follow later. Chairs may remain pulled close longer than usual. You sense how hospitality lingers after food is gone. It reshapes the night, turning routine into occasion without changing the meal itself. And as the table settles back into stillness, you feel how a single extra presence has revealed something essential. Supper here is not just about feeding those who belong, it is about making room when belonging is temporary, and doing so with steady practiced grace. As the guest settles and the bowls grow lighter, the table begins to speak in a different way. Not loudly, not all at once. Words slip out sideways, carried on breath between bites, released only when chewing pauses long enough to make space. You notice how no one clears their throat to begin. There is no announcement that conversation is starting. It simply happens the way a fire catches slowly, almost by accident. Someone mentions the weather not as small talk but as information. Rain expected. Frost coming early, wind shifting. These details matter. They shape tomorrow's work before it begins. In surviving letters from the period mealtime, conversation is often recorded only indirectly. People wrote about what was decided, not how it was said. That suggests talk at supper leaned practical, focused on what needed doing rather than how anyone felt about it. You hear that practicality now, a short sentence about a fence needing repair, a nod in response, a task quietly assigned without sounding like an order. Advice moves this way too. A reminder slipped into a story, a correction offered as memory rather than command. Someone recalls how something went wrong once, letting the lesson settle without pointing a finger. There is a revealing moment when a child asks a question that does not quite fit. It hovers for a second awkward. An adult answers anyway, briefly steering it back toward a usefulness. Curiosity is allowed, but shaped. An odd detail from a rural diary describes supper talk as a place where instruction hid in plain sight. Children learned how to plant, trade, bargain, and judge weather long before they were expected to act on that knowledge. Listening counted as participation. You sense that layered learning here. Words carry weight. No one wastes them. When someone speaks, others listen without interruption, not out of politeness, but habit. Stories appear, but they are not long. A sentence or two about a neighbour, a comment about a tool that broke, a shared memory from last season. These fragments stitch the household into a larger world beyond the table. Some researchers suggest that supper talk served as informal governance where plans were aligned and disagreements softened. Others argue that conflict often went unspoken at the table, save for private moments. Both possibilities seem present here. What is said is careful. What is unsaid lingers quietly. You notice that humour surfaces rarely, but when it does, it lands gently. A dry remark, a raised eyebrow, a brief smile that fades as quickly as it appeared. Laughter is soft, controlled, never disruptive. The guest listens more than speaks, absorbing tone and rhythm. When they do speak, it is in response to what has already been said, never steering the conversation away from the household's centre. As bowls near empty, talk slows again, words become shorter. Pauses lengthen. Eating and speaking take turns rather than overlapping. You realise how different this feels from modern meals filled with chatter. Here, speech is functional and connective, not constant. Silence remains the dominant language, with words used only when they add something. A small but telling habit emerges. When someone finishes speaking, no one rushes to respond. The thought is allowed to sit, meaning settles before the next sound enters the room. You feel how this pacing keeps emotions even. Without quick reactions, tensions have little room to flare. Everything moves at the speed of chewing and swallowing. There is still uncertainty among historians about how expressive families were in private versus public. Records favour restraint, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What you feel here is restraint chosen, not imposed. As the last practical matters are spoken, conversation thins naturally. No one announces its end, it simply runs out of reason to continue. Hands return fully to bowls, eyes lower. The fire resumes its role as primary sound. You sit within that shift, noticing how talk has done its work without ever taking over the meal. Plans have been set, knowledge shared, bonds maintained. And as the table grows quiet again, you sense how this sideways conversation, never loud or central, forms the connective tissue of family life, passing guidance and memory forward in fragments one supper at a time as the evening continues to settle. As conversation thins and the bowls show their bottoms, attention drifts towards behaviour rather than words. Manners make themselves known here not through rules recited or corrections delivered, but through repetition. What feels normal has been learned slowly over years of sitting at this same table. You notice how people wipe their mouths before speaking, how hands are kept close to bowls, how reaching happens carefully to avoid crossing another's space. None of this feels stiff. It feels practice shaped by necessity more than instruction. Guides written for households in the 18th century often framed good behaviour at the table in practical terms. Clean hands prevented illness, controlled movements reduced spills, courtesy preserved harmony in tight quarters. Manners served survival as much as social order. You feel that practicality now. A careless elbow could knock a bowl. A rushed reach could waste food. Politeness is not about refinement. It is about not making more work for anyone else. A child forgets and reaches too quickly, brushing another person's hand. There is a brief pause, then a small adjustment. No scolding follows. The correction has already happened. Experience teaches faster than words. You notice how no one eats faster than the person setting the pace. When that person slows, everyone else follows. This keeps the meal aligned, preventing anyone from finishing too early or waiting too long. There is an odd note in a Massachusetts household manual that advises keeping elbows off the table, not because it looked rude, but because it crowded space needed for shared bowls. Even familiar rules carried practical roots. You become aware of how people manage sound. Spoons are set down gently, bowls are slid rather than lifted when possible. Loud clatter would draw attention, and attention feels unnecessary now. Hands are wiped on cloths that have seen countless uses. No one expects them to be spotless. Clean enough is the goal. Excess fuss would feel strange here. Some writers have suggested that early American table behavior lacked refinement. Others counter that refinement simply took a different form. Watching these movements, you see precision, restraint, and awareness, even without ceremony. You notice that posture matters less than presence. People lean hunch, relax, but they remain attentive to those around them. Manners here are relational, not rigid. A small but revealing habit appears. When someone finishes eating, they do not immediately leave the table. They wait. Rising too soon would disrupt the shared rhythm. Ending together matters more than individual readiness. You sense how this shared ending reinforces belonging. Supper is not a series of individual acts. It is a collective one, beginning and ending as a group whenever possible. There remains disagreement among scholars about how strictly manners were enforced across different households and regions. Wealth, religion, and family size all played roles. Sitting here, enforcement feels minimal because expectation is internalized. You find yourself mirroring these habits without effort. Your movements grow quieter. Your pace matches the table. Manners feel less like rules and more like alignment. A crumb drops, is brushed aside without comment. Nothing here demands perfection, only awareness. You notice how children learn through proximity. They watch hands, not faces. They copy motion, not instruction. Manners pass hand to hand night after night. As the fire burns lower, the room grows stiller. Manners become even more subtle, expressed through patience and timing rather than gesture. You realize how these quiet practices preserve dignity. In a world where privacy is scarce and resources limited, small courtesies create space where none physically exists. When the last bites are taken, bowls are set down almost simultaneously. This coordination is not planned. It emerges from shared attention. No one leans back dramatically. No one declares themselves full. Completion is signaled through stillness. You feel the calm that follows. Manners have done their work. The meal has ended cleanly without friction or excess. As the table settles into this quiet completion, you sense how behaviour here has been shaped by years of trial and adjustment. What remains is not polish but grace of a quieter kind. And as you rest your hands and breathe out softly, you understand how these practical manners learned without fuss allow the household to move forward together, carrying ease and respect into whatever the night still holds. Even as the table rests in that calm after eating something unseen remains very present. Memory. Not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind that shapes how people behave without needing explanation. You feel it in the way bowls were scraped carefully, in how bread was broken into measured pieces, in how no one lingered too long over what was already gone. Scarcity lived quietly at this table, even on nights when there is enough. You sense it in posture. People lean forward when food arrives, then settle back only after they are certain everyone has eaten. No one assumes tomorrow will look like today. Supper is enjoyed but never taken for granted. Many families in 1700s America lived close to the edge of uncertainty. Harvests failed, weather turned, illness arrived without warning. Written records from farms and settlements often mention stretches of plenty right alongside stretches of worry, sometimes within the same year. That knowledge does not fade quickly. You notice how older members of the household eat differently. Slower, more deliberate, they pause between bites as if measuring something beyond hunger. Their hands move with caution learned long ago. A quiet habit surfaces. Someone saves the last piece of bread, not eating it immediately, just keeping it near. This is not indecision, it is reassurance. Knowing there is still something left feels important. There is a small recollection preserved in a Virginia letter where an elderly woman described never finishing her bowl completely even when full. She said leaving a small amount made her feel prepared, as if hunger could not surprise her again. Whether common or personal, the feeling is recognizable. You feel how scarcity teaches anticipation. People do not wait to feel empty before adjusting. They eat with awareness of what remains in storage, what can be replaced and what cannot. Children absorb this memory even if they have not experienced true lack themselves. They learn from watching what adults protect, which foods are guarded, which are stretched, which are eaten first. The absence of waste is not enforced through fear. It is shaped through remembrance. Someone once went without. That experience echoes forward. Some historians emphasize that colonial diets appear modest because people lacked choice. Others point out that the moderation itself became a learned strategy. Sitting in moderation feels intentional, it carries purpose. You notice that no one asks for seconds impulsively. Requests are weighed. Eyes flick to the pot. A pause precedes any reaching. Hunger is real, but so is restraint. There is a quiet relief when the meal reaches its end, and enough remains for later. That relief settles in shoulders, in breath, in the ease of stillness that follows. You sense how food scarcity also shapes emotion. Gratitude here is not enthusiastic. It is steady, calm, almost subdued. Big reactions would feel risky, tempting fate. The fire burns lower now and the light dims. This too carries memory. Darkness once meant danger, cold uncertainty. The habit of finishing tasks before nightfall lingers, shaping how supper ends without delay. Someone gathers crumbs into their palm and eats them rather than brushing them to the floor. The motion is automatic. No one notices, yet everyone would recognize it if it did not happen. There remains uncertainty among scholars about how frequently true famine touched ordinary families versus how much fear of it guided behavior. Records capture extreme moments more clearly than long stretches of careful living. What feels certain is that caution was inherited as much as experienced. You feel that inheritance now. Even in comfort, people behave as if comfort must be protected. The table itself reflects this memory. Repairs made instead of replacements. Bowls kept long past fashion. Nothing is discarded simply because it is worn. A child reaches for another piece of bread and hesitates, glancing at an adult. The adult nods small and sure. Permission is granted, but the pause mattered. Awareness was demonstrated. You realize how scarcity sharpens attention. It teaches people to notice what remains, not just what is consumed. Supper becomes an exercise in accounting without numbers. As the meal fades fully and the household prepares to move on, you feel how memory lingers longer than hunger. Full stomachs do not erase old lessons. Scarcity also shapes hope. People plan, they save, they prepare for lean times quietly without drama. Supper is both nourishment and rehearsal. You sense how this shapes family identity. Carefulness becomes a virtue. Waste becomes uncomfortable. Enough becomes a goal, not excess. As bowls are finally gathered and hands rest, there is no sense of regret. The meal has been handled well. That is satisfaction enough. And as the room settles deeper into evening, you feel how the memory of scarcity does not darken the moment. Instead, it steadies it, giving supper weight and meaning, reminding everyone at the table that what they have shared tonight matters precisely because it cannot be assumed. As the memory of scarcity settles back into the walls, you begin to notice something quieter still. Difference. Not conflict, not division, just variation. Supper in 1700s America does not look the same everywhere, even when the motions feel familiar. You imagine another table far from this one, where the bowls hold different colours, different textures. Climate shapes taste. Soil decides what thrives. Geography speaks through supper without raising its voice. In northern regions, meals lean heavier toward grains, roots, and preserved foods that endure long winters. In southern households, corn takes centre stage more often, paired with greens that grow stubbornly through heat. Along the coast, fish replaces meat without apology. Inland, it is rarely seen. You feel how these differences do not feel exotic to those living them. They are normal, expected. Supper tastes like where you are. Someone at this table mentions a cousin living farther south. The comment is brief, tied to food. They eat differently there, no judgment follows, just acknowledgement. Travel accounts from the period quietly confirm these variations. Visitors often remark that familiar foods tasted unfamiliar depending on where they were served. Same names, different outcomes. Corn could be bread porridge or something in between depending on who prepared it. You sense how these regional habits anchor identity. People know where they come from by what fills their bowls. Even when moving, tastes follow, adapting slowly rather than changing overnight. A small observation appears in a merchant's journal describing how travellers carried food preferences with them like luggage. They sought familiar textures more than flavours. Comfort mattered. At this table you notice a preparation style that feels specific. Vegetables cooked longer than some might prefer. Bread baked denser than others would choose. These are not accidents, they are inherited choices. There is still disagreement among historians about how much regional difference existed within families who migrated. Some evidence suggests rapid adaptation. Other accounts describe stubborn preservation of old habits. Tonight you feel continuity more than change. This meal tastes like home wherever that home began. Children learn these distinctions early. What tastes right becomes instinctive. What tastes strange becomes noticeable. Preference forms long before choice is available. You realize that regional difference also shapes expectation. A guest from elsewhere might eat politely but with surprise. A host might notice hesitation without comment. Supper absorbs difference quietly. The fire burns the same everywhere, but what it cooks changes. The same pot holds different futures depending on what is poured into it. A curious note from a backcountry traveller describes being offered a meal that felt incomplete to him, only to realise later that his idea of completeness was regional, not universal. Supper had been sufficient. His expectations had been narrow. You reflect on that now. There is no single correct version of this meal. There are only versions that make sense where they are. The table feels steady in that understanding. No one compares this supper to another. Comparison would serve no purpose. As bowls are cleared and the meal recedes into memory, the flavours linger differently for each person. What feels ordinary to one feels defining to another. You sense how regional habits quietly reinforce belonging. Eating the same foods in the same way night after night creates a shared language that does not need words. Even disagreements about food preparation rarely surface here. There is no sense in arguing with tradition when tradition has kept people fed. As the evening deepens, the idea of elsewhere feels distant. Supper anchors everyone firmly in this place, this climate, this rhythm. You feel how these regional differences do not fragment experience. They enrich it. They allow many versions of the same evening to exist across the land, each valid, each familiar to those who live it. And as the table empties and tension drifts toward what comes next, you understand how supper becomes a quiet declaration of place, reminding everyone present exactly where they are, and why that matters as the night continues to unfold. As the table settles and the room grows quieter, you become aware of something that has been present all along, without taking a seat. Labour. Not the visible kind that ate and rested and leaned back, but the kind that shaped this meal while remaining just outside the circle. You feel it in what is missing as much as in what is present. The food arrived on time, the fire stayed steady, the bowls were filled. None of that happened by accident. In many households across parts of the 1700s, America, especially in the southern colonies, enslaved people lived and worked close enough to family spaces to influence them deeply, even when they were not included at the table. Their work shaped the rhythm of supper long before anyone sat down. You notice how smoothly everything moved tonight, how ingredients were ready, how the fire never faltered. That smoothness often depended on hands that did not sit here, hands that prepared, carried, cleaned and waited. The awareness is subtle, but it presses in gently once you feel it. Supper feels complete yet incomplete at the same time. You imagine movement just beyond the doorway. Footsteps soft on packed earth. A presence listening without being invited to speak. Someone who knows exactly when the meal will end because cleanup will begin immediately after. Written records from plantations and larger households mention meals often, but they rarely mention who cooked them by name. The absence itself speaks. Labour is acknowledged through outcome, not credit. You notice how leftovers are handled carefully. Some food will be saved, some will be redistributed. The decisions are quiet, practiced. Food moves through layers of the household, not all of them visible at once. There is a small but telling detail preserved in a few letters from enslavers who complained when meals were late. The complaint itself reveals expectation. Food appeared when needed because someone else was made responsible for making it so. You feel the weight of that expectation now. Supper here is not just nourishment, it is structure. It rests on enforced routines that did not apply equally to everyone involved. The presence of enslaved labour also shapes silence. Certain topics do not surface. Certain acknowledgements do not occur. The table maintains its calm by leaving some realities unspoken. Children at the table may or may not fully understand this. They see people moving in and out of rooms. They learn names or they do not. They absorb hierarchy before they can name it. Some historians emphasize how normalized this division became within households that relied on enslaved labor. Others focus on moments where boundaries blurred, where proximity created complicated relationships. Sitting here, complexity feels unavoidable. Lives overlapped without equality. You sense how the meal itself carries contradiction. Warmth and comfort for some rested on constraint and exhaustion for others. Supper does not resolve this tension, it contains it. There is an odd moment when someone pauses as if about to speak, then does not. The pause passes, the meal continues. Silence keeps the shape of the evening intact. You realize that absence has texture. It is felt in who is allowed to rest when the meal ends, who lingers to clean, who returns to work while others lean back. Some accounts from the period describe enslaved people eating later after family meals ended, sometimes from the same pot, sometimes from scraps. Timing mattered, order mattered. You feel how time itself is unevenly distributed. Rest comes earlier for some, later for others. Supper marks a boundary, but not everyone crosses it together. The firelight does not distinguish between faces, but social rules do. Proximity does not equal belonging. There remains debate among scholars about how often enslaved people shared meals with the households they served, especially in smaller homes. Evidence suggests variation. Tonight's separation feels deliberate, reinforced by routine. You sit with that knowledge quietly. Supper becomes heavier, not in guilt, but in awareness. History presses close without needing to explain itself. As bowls are gathered and chairs shift, the household prepares to move on. For some, this means rest. For others, it means more work. You notice how gratitude, when expressed, flows upward, not outward. Thanks are given to those at the table, rarely to those beyond it. The room feels calm, but the calm is layered. It rests on order, and that order rests on unequal footing. You do not hear voices from outside the table now, but you feel their imprint everywhere. In the clean bowls, in the steady fire, in the ease with which the evening progresses. Supper in this light becomes not just a family ritual, but reflection of a larger system, one that shaped daily life through habits that felt ordinary to those inside them. As the household settles deeper into evening, you hold that complexity gently. The meal has ended, but its meaning has expanded, and as you breathe in the lingering warmth and smell of food, you recognize that supper in 1700s America carried more than nourishment. It carried presence and absence together, shaping the night in ways both visible and unseen, continuing to echo long after the table itself falls quiet. As the room settles again after the quiet weight of awareness, your attention drifts back to the food itself, to something so familiar it almost disappears. Certain flavors have been here longer than this household, longer than this table, longer even than the language spoken around it. Native foods remain woven so tightly into daily life that no one pauses to name them. You taste it in the corn, not just bread or porridge, but the deeper presence of maize in many forms. Ground, boiled, baked, thickened into stews. Corn does not announce its origins, it simply continues. Long before European settlement reshaped the land, indigenous communities cultivated crops that proved resilient, nourishing and adaptable. Corn beans and squash in particular became foundational to colonial diets, not as curiosities but as necessities learned through observation and exchange. You feel how ordinary this now seems at the table. No one calls the food foreign. No one treats it as borrowed. It belongs here even if its story began elsewhere. Beans soften in the bowl, having simmered long enough to lose sharpness. Squash adds body and sweetness. These foods work together quietly, supporting one another, filling gaps that bread and meat alone could not. A small detail appears in a missionary's journal from the early 18th century. He remarked that settlers often forgot which foods came from where, assuming they had always eaten this way. Familiarity erased origin. You sense that erasure. No. The meal feels complete, self-contained. Its deeper history hums beneath the surface, unnoticed but essential. Children at the table know these foods as comfort, not novelty. Their bodies recognize the fullness they bring. Their tastes were shaped early by what grew well here, not by what crossed oceans. Some writers emphasize how quickly settlers adopted indigenous crops out of necessity. Others point out how knowledge was often taken without acknowledgement. Both realities sit uncomfortably close. Sitting here, you feel how survival blurred lines that later generations struggle to redraw. You notice how these foods behave. They forgive long cooking. They stretch easily. They feed many without complaint. This reliability explains their entropy better than any story. The pot itself tells a part of this history. It holds ingredients that came together through exchange, conflict, adaptation, and learning. Supper becomes a quiet record of contact and change. A curious aside appears in a few colonial cookbooks. Recipes using corn or beans were often written as if no explanation was needed, while European dishes were sometimes described in detail. What required explanation had become reversed. You taste that reversal now. Nothing about this food feels introduced, it feels inherited. You realize how often history hides in plain sight like this, not in monuments or documents, but in bowls, passed hand to hand night after night. There is still uncertainty among historians about how consciously settlers understood the origins of what they ate, especially across generations. Knowledge may have faded, even as practice remained. What feels clear is that indigenous food shapes daily survival far more than many later narratives admit. The firelight catches the surface of the stew, revealing thickness, depth, patience. These ingredients ask for time, not precision. They reward waiting. You feel how this food anchors the meal emotionally. It steadies hunger without excitement. It comforts without calling attention to itself. As the bowls near empty again, these flavors linger differently than meat did earlier. They do not feel rare or fleeting. They feel constant. You notice that no one speaks of these foods as special. Their importance lies in their reliability. They return night after night, season after season. The evening deepens and the table grows quieter. These foods have done their work thoroughly. You sit with the realization that supper here carries histories layered quietly together. Indigenous knowledge, Colonial, adaptation, family habits, all folded into a single meal. As the fire settles lower and hands rest again, you feel how these ingredients, so ordinary they almost vanish, have shaped lives for generations, feeding bodies, shaping taste and carrying forward a legacy that continues without needing to be named. And as the night moves gently onward, you sense how what endures longest is often what draws the least attention, sustaining the table secretly as the household drifts further into evening. As the heavier bowls are eased away and the table clears just enough to breathe, something small appears, if it appears at all. Sweetness, not lavish, not abundant. Just a quiet note at the edge of the meal, arriving without ceremony. You notice it in a dish passed carefully, almost cautiously. A spoonful of stewed fruit, a bit of honey drizzled where it will stretch farthest, and perhaps a small cake, dense and dark, meant to be shared rather than claimed. Dessert here does not follow supper. It tucks itself into it. In many households during the 1700s, sugar was costly and not always easy to come by. Sweet foods existed, but they were measured carefully, treated more as accent than reward. What sweetness appeared often came from fruit molasses or honey rather than refined sugar. You lift a bite and taste how restrained it is. The sweetness does not overwhelm. It supports. It rounds the edges of the meal rather than announcing a new phase. A child's eyes brighten just a little. Not wildly, just enough to show recognition. This is something different, something noticed. The child eats slowly, instinctively, understanding that this portion will not be replaced. There is a small recollection recorded in a rural letter describing a family who saved dried apples specifically for Sundays. The writer noted how the anticipation mattered as much as the taste. Sweetness marked time. You feel that sense of marking now. This sweetness does not belong to every night. It signals something modest but meaningful, completion, care, perhaps even celebration, though quiet enough to avoid tempting excess. You notice how portions are kept small on purpose. No one reaches for more without hesitation. Sweetness is shared, not accumulated. Some interpretations suggest that desserts in early America were less about indulgence and more about preservation. Fruit was sweetened to last through winter. Honey was stored for lean times. Pleasure and practicality intertwined. You taste that practicality now. The sweetness feels grounded. It carries the flavour of patience, of waiting months for fruit to dry or syrup to thicken. The firelight catches the surface of the dish, making it glisten briefly. The moment feels delicate. This is not the kind of food you rush. You notice how adults treat this part of the meal differently. Bites are smaller. Conversation pauses. Attention narrows again, not from hunger, but from appreciation. There is still uncertainty among those who study domestic life about how frequently sweets appeared at ordinary suppers. Some records suggest rarity. Others hint at regular but minimal presence. What feels clear here is intention. Sweetness is handled carefully regardless of frequency. A spoon scrapes the bottom of the dish, gently gathering the last bit. No one minds who gets it. The act itself feels complete. You sense how sweetness closes the circle of the meal without pushing it outward. It does not demand more eating. It signals that enough has been had. Children linger over their bites longer than necessary, stretching the moment. Adults allow it. There is no hurry now. The sweetness lingers on the tongue even after the dish is gone. It changes how the rest of the evening feels. Softer, slower. You rest your hands on the table and breathe out gently. The meal has reached a turning point. What follows will move toward rest. Sweetness here has done its work quietly. It has marked the meal as cared for, not just assembled. It has offered a moment of pleasure without excess. As the dish is cleared and the table grows simpler again, you feel how this restrained sweetness leaves behind something more lasting than taste. It leaves a sense of balance. And as the night continues to settle around the household, that balance carries forward, reminding everyone that even small comforts, when handled with care, can shape memory and make an ordinary supper feel gently complete. As the last traces of sweetness fade and bowls are gathered closer to the centre, another presence makes itself felt. It is quieter than hunger and heavier than taste. Health. not as a topic of conversation, but as an undercurrent shaping how people eat, how much they take and when they stop. You notice it in small decisions. Someone leaves a portion unfinished, not from disinterest, but from caution. Another eats more slowly than earlier, chewing carefully, as if listening to their body rather than the table. In the 1700s, illness was a familiar companion in daily life. Colds lingered. Fevers came and went. Digestion mattered because discomfort could quickly become something worse. Supper was one of the few moments when people could respond to how they felt, physically adjusting without explanation. You sense how the meal has been calibrated to avoid excess. Heavy foods were balanced with softer ones, strong flavours softened by bread and drink. Nothing here aims to challenge the body at the end of a long day. A child coughs lightly once then again. An adult glances over, measuring sound and rhythm. No alarm follows. Coughs are common, so are aches. Bodies speak constantly here, and people have learned to listen without panic. There is a revealing note in a mid-century physician's letter, describing how patients were advised to eat warm, simple foods in the evening, believing cold or rich meals invited trouble overnight. Whether effective or not, the advice shaped habits. You feel that belief at work now. Supper feels designed to settle, not stimulate. The fire's warmth, the softness of cooked food, the gentle pacing all work together to prepare bodies for rest. You notice that elders eat differently still. Smaller bites, longer pauses. They know their limits well. Experience taught them that discomfort at night costs more than hunger. Some interpretations of early health practices emphasize superstition. Others point out patterns that align with modern understanding of digestion and rest. Sitting here, the line between knowledge and belief feels less important than outcome. People aim to wake well. You realize how health shapes restraint. Finishing everything on the table is not always the goal. Feeling steady is. A child pushes a bowl away slightly, face pale with fullness. No one insists they finish. The signal is clear enough. Eating beyond comfort would invite trouble later. You sense how illness lingers in memory too. Someone here remembers a night when a stomachache turned serious. Another recalls a fever that came without warning. Those memories inform tonight's choices silently. There is a small but telling habit when someone feels unwell. They drink more slowly. They favour bread. They avoid what might sit too heavy. These adjustments happen without discussion. The room itself feels tuned for recovery. Warmth holds steady, light dims gradually. Noise remains low. Supper does not end with stimulation, but with calm. You notice how talk avoids topics that might upset digestion. No arguments, no raised voices. Even laughter stays gentle. Emotional balance matters as much as physical comfort. There remains uncertainty among historians about how much people understood illness versus simply feared it. Records capture remedies and advice, but understanding came mostly through lived experience. What feels clear here is attentiveness. As the mill winds fully down, people check in with themselves. Shoulders roll, back straighten. A few quiet sighs mark relief rather than satisfaction. You feel how supper has functioned as care. Not medical care, but preventative. A daily effort to keep bodies steady in a world where small discomforts could grow quickly. The fire settles lower and the room cools slightly. This too is part of health. Avoiding sweat, avoiding chill, balance again. As bowls are finally cleared and hands rest, you sense how this meal has prepared the household not just for sleep, but for waking without pain. That in this world counts as success. And as you breathe in the calm that follows you, feel how the attention to health, quiet and constant, has shaped every bite tonight, guiding the supper gently toward the rest, and carrying everyone forward into the night with care rather than strain. As the table empties and the weight of eating gives way to stillness, attention turns almost automatically to what remains. Not what has been consumed, but what can be kept. Leftovers are not an afterthought here. They are part of the plan. You notice how bowls are not scraped carelessly. Each one is checked, tilted, considered. A spoon pauses to gather what might otherwise be lost. Even small amounts are noticed, especially small amounts. In many households of this time, cooking once and eating many times was not laziness, but wisdom. Fuel took effort. Ingredients took time. Preparing enough to stretch into tomorrow or even the next day reduced risk and labor alike. You see decisions being made quietly. This portion will cool and be saved. That one will be eaten now. Something will be mixed with the bread in the morning. Another bit might thicken a future pot. No one writes this down. Everyone understands. A cloth is laid over a bowl rather than a lid placed firmly. Cooling matters. Moisture must escape before storage. These small adjustments carry knowledge, passed hand to hand rather than taught outright. There is an almost tender moment when someone sets aside a portion that could easily be finished tonight. Hunger could justify it. Instead, foresight wins. Tomorrow has already been invited to supper. You feel how leftovers represent continuity. The meal does not end at the table. It flows forward, reshaped and reused. Food carries memory and intention into the next day. A small detail preserved in household notes mentions how stews and porridges were often better on the second-day flavours deepening overnight. This belief encouraged saving, not scarcity, but patience. You notice how containers are chosen carefully. A pot kept near the hearth to cool slowly. A bowl placed farther away to avoid spoilage. Storage here is about placement as much as preservation. Children watch this process closely. They learn which foods return and which vanish. They learn to recognize tomorrow in tonight's remains. Some writers emphasize that leftovers were essential because waste carried consequences. Others point out that saving food also offered comfort, knowing something was already prepared. Sitting here, both motivations feel present. Prudence and relief work together. You realize how leftovers shape morning as much as evening. Breakfast will be quicker. Hunger will be answered sooner. Work can begin earlier. Supper's influence stretches ahead. The room feels purposeful again for a brief moment. Eating may be done, but attention sharpens as planning takes over. Bowls shift. Cloths are folded. Decisions are finalized without ceremony. There is no debate about ownership. Leftovers belong to the household, not to individuals. Tomorrow's needs outweigh tonight's preferences. You notice how someone tastes a small spoonful before covering a dish. A final check. Flavor matters even when saving. Quality must carry forward too. A quiet satisfaction settles in when everything is accounted for. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. Supper has been handled well. The fire burns lower now, but its warmth still helps. Cooling food slowly matters. The hearth continues its role even after eating ends. You feel how this careful management eases anxiety. Knowing food remains reduces the sharpness of tomorrow's uncertainty. Planning is its own kind of comfort. There is still variation in how different households treated leftovers. Some reused aggressively, others cautiously. Tonight, the approach feels balanced. Enough is saved, enough is eaten. As the last bowl is set aside, the table looks different, less crowded, more open. The meal has transformed into preparation. You rest your hands and breathe out slowly. The rhythm of the evening shifts again. The urgency of hunger is long gone. The quiet assurance of readiness takes its place. Leftovers modest and uncelebrated have extended the meal beyond its final bite. They promise continuity without extravagance. And as the household prepares to move fully away from the table, you feel how this careful attention to what remains carries supper forward into the unseen hours, linking tonight's nourishment with tomorrow's survival in a steady, reassuring line. As the last decisions about saving food are made, the meal does not end with a flourish. It loosens. People do not rise all at once. Chairs shift gradually. The table releases its hold on the room a little at a time. You notice how no one says that supper is finished. The end arrives quietly, marked by smaller gestures. A bowl moved aside, hands wiped slowly. A long breath that feels different from hunger or effort. In many homes of this period, the conclusion of a meal blended seamlessly into the rest of the evening. There was no clear boundary between eating and whatever came next. Supper simply dissolved into routine. Someone stands stretching, carefully joints stiff from both work and sitting. Another remains seated, hands folded, eyes drifting toward the fire. The room allows for both. Ending together matters, but not rigidly. You feel how bodies choose their own timing now. Hunger no longer dictates movement. Comfort and fatigue take over. There is a small moment when someone considers leaving the table early, then waits instead. Rising too soon would feel abrupt. The shared rhythm still holds lightly, asking for patience a moment longer. An old household letter mentions that families often lingered after eating, not for conversation, but to let food settle before returning to activity. Moving too quickly was believed to invite discomfort. You sense that wisdom here. The stillness that follows eating feels intentional. It gives the body time to adjust, to shift from effort to rest without shock. Children begin to slide off benches one by one, not running, just drifting. Their movements are quiet, respectful of the mood. Someone gathers them, gently guiding them toward the next phase of the evening. The fire crackles softly, offering continuity. It has witnessed the entire meal and will witness what comes after. Supper ends, but the hearth remains. You notice how the table itself looks different now, scarred wood visible again, fewer objects resting on it. It returns to being a surface rather than a centre. There is a sense of completion that does not need acknowledgement. Everyone feels it at the same time. The work of eating is done. Some observers of the period remarked on how meals ended without ceremony, especially in working households. What mattered was that food had been eaten and bodies were ready for what followed. You feel how this lack of formality keeps the evening flexible. There is no obligation to linger longer than needed, no pressure to perform gratitude outwardly. Satisfaction remains internal. Someone clears their throat not to speak, but to signal readiness. Another nods. The exchange is subtle, understood without words. As chairs begin to scrape back more deliberately, the spell of the table breaks gently. People stand, stretch, gather themselves. You rise too, feeling the weight of the meal settle comfortably. Full but not heavy, warm but not sluggish. The room shifts. Attention moves outward again. Tasks await. Rest approaches. Supper has played its part and steps aside. You glance back at the table once more. It no longer demands focus. It has released everyone with quiet confidence. The firelight dims further, shadows deepening in corners. Evening asserts itself fully now. As people move away from the table, the meal fades without drama. No applause, no closing words, just the natural easing apart of bodies that have shared enough. And as you follow that movement into the next quiet phase of the night, you feel how the end of supper here is not an ending at all, but a gentle transition carrying the household forward without hurry, without strain, and without needing to say goodbye to the table that has done its work. As people drift away from the table, the work does not disappear. It simply changes shape. Cleanup begins without announcement, folding itself into the evening the way supper folded into the day. You notice how movements stay unhurried. Bowls are gathered carefully stacked in an order that makes sense to those who have done this countless times before. Nothing clatters. Noise would feel out of place now. In many households of this era, washing dishes was not a single task completed all at once. It happened in stages shaped by water temperature, light and remaining energy. Some items were cleaned immediately, others waited until morning. You watch as water is poured into a basin still warm from the hearth. Hands test it before plunging in. Too hot would burn, too cool would not clean well. The balance is found by feel. A cloth already worn thin moves in steady circles. It knows the shape of these bowls. Grease lifts slowly. Steam rises faintly, carrying the last sense of supper upward. There is a quiet rhythm to the sin's work. Lift, rinse, set aside, repeat. The repetition feels calming, almost meditative. Supper dissolves fully here, transforming from nourishment into memory. You notice that children are sometimes given small tasks, carrying light items, fetching water, watching closely. Participation matters more than efficiency. Cleanup teaches responsibility without lectures. A small observation appears in a domestic journal from the period. The writer noted that evenings felt longer when dishes were left undone and shorter when cleanup was finished quickly. Order shaped time. You feel that truth now. Each bowl cleaned closes the meal more completely. The room feels lighter as surfaces clear. Some items are wiped rather than washed. Water is precious. Not everything needs to be spotless tonight. Clean enough will suffice. You notice how crumbs are gathered and set aside. Nothing is swept away carelessly. Even during cleanup, waste is avoided. There remains variation in how the households approach this work. Some insisted on finishing everything before rest. Others left what could wait. Tonight the choices feel guided by fatigue and light rather than rule. As the last bowl is rinsed, it is set upside down to dry. That small act signals completion. The cycle is closed. The table itself is wiped next, not scrubbed, just cleared of traces. The scars remain. They always will. Only the day's evidence is removed. You feel how cleanup changes the atmosphere. The table loses its pull. The room expands again. Space returns. The fire is banked lower. Heat reduced to what is needed to keep the room comfortable. Ashes shifted carefully, not stirred more than necessary. You notice how the people who clean do not linger to admire their work. Satisfaction is quiet, the absence of mess is enough. A child yawns leaning against an adult. Evening has advanced further than it seemed. Some historians suggest that cleanup routines reinforce social roles within households. Others argue that necessity blurred those lines more often than records suggest. Watching here, roles feel practiced but flexible, shaped by who has energy left. As hands are dried and cloths hung to air, the last physical trace of supper fades. What remains is warmth, fullness, and the promise of rest. You breathe in the cleaner air of the room, noticing how the smell of food has softened into something faint and comforting. The table stands ready again, empty but familiar, waiting for whatever comes next tomorrow. And as the household settles into the quieter stretch of night, you feel how cleanup, simple and repetitive, completes the meal's journey, turning shared food into shared memory and easing everyone gently toward the calm that follows. Once the dishes are set aside and the table stands bare again, something intangible lingers in the room. It does not smell exactly, though faint traces of supper still cling to the air. It is not sound either, though the fire continues its soft work. What remains is feeling, the emotional residue of having eaten together. You sense it as you pause near the table, hands idle now, no longer needed. The space feels fuller than it did before the meal began, even though it holds less. Supper has left an imprint. You notice how people move differently now. Steps slow, voices drop even further. Shoulders loosen in a way that only happens when hunger and urgency are gone. This is the hour when effort releases its grip. In personal writings from the 18th century evenings are often described vaguely. Words like quiet, settled, or done appear without much elaboration. What mattered was not what happened, but how it felt afterward. You understand that simplicity now. There is nothing left to accomplish in this moment. The important work has been completed. Food was shared. The household is intact. Someone sits again, not at the table this time, but nearby, close enough to the warmth. Another leans against the wall, arms crossed loosely. No one feels the need to fill the silence. You notice how memory surfaces without invitation. A passing look between two people recalls a meal long ago. A certain smell brings back a winter supper from years past. These memories do not demand attention. They drift through gently and move on. A small observation from a Colonial diary describes how evenings after supper felt safest. The doors were barred. The fire was steady. Everyone was accounted for. Safety in that sense was temporary but real. You feel that sense of enclosure now. The world beyond the walls fades further into abstraction. Inside, everything is known and accounted for. Children grow quieter, their energy finally spent. One rests their head against an adult's side. Another sits on the floor, tracing patterns in dust with a finger content without direction. You sense how supper strengthened bonds without conversation. Eating together aligns bodies and rhythms. Even disagreement softens when stomachs are full and warmth is shared. There is still uncertainty among those who study a family life about how emotionally close households truly were. Letters reveal restraint more often than affection. But moments like this suggest connection expressed through presence rather than words. You feel how that presence fills the room now. No one leaves abruptly, no one withdraws sharply. Togetherness continues without being named. The firelight flickers lower, casting longer shadows. The room takes on a softer shape. Corners blur, edges recede. The space becomes more forgiving. You notice how breathing synchronizes. One slow breath answered by another. The house settles into a shared pace guided by fullness and fatigue. A faint smile passes between two people without explanation. It carries no message beyond contentment. You realize how rarely this feeling is recorded. It leaves no mark on paper. It is not measurable, yet it may be the most enduring part of supper. The table now cleared still anchors the room emotionally. It holds what just happened even when nothing rests on it. As time stretches gently, no one rushes to move the evening along. There is value in staying right here, balanced between activity and rest. You feel how this lingering calm prepares the household for sleep. Bodies are fed, minds are eased. The day has been closed properly. The outside world, with its demands and uncertainties, feels distant and manageable. For now, it has been held at bay by food and fire and shared routine. As you stand within this softened atmosphere, you understand how supper extends far beyond eating. It creates a cushion of emotional safety that carries the family through the darker hours. And as the night deepens and the fire burns lower still, that quiet aftertaste of togetherness remains unspoken, but steady, guiding everyone gently toward rest, wrapped in the simple reassurance that comes from having shared a meal and survived another day together. As the calm settles deeper and movement slows, you begin to sense how this evening fits into something larger. Supper was not a single event isolated in time. It was one repetition among many, each one laying a thin layer of memory over the last. You feel it in the way the room seems to know what comes next. No one asks what evening tasks remain. Bodies drift toward familiar places. Hands reach for tools or blankets without instruction. Routine carries everyone forward. In family records and recollections from the 18th century, meals rarely stand alone. They are mentioned as part of cycles. Days grouped by work, weeks marked by small variations, years remembered through repeated patterns rather than standout moments. You sense how these repeated suppers shape identity quietly. Eating the same foods, sitting in the same places, ending the day in the same way. Over time, these habits define what family feels like. Children grow within these patterns. Their earliest memories are not of singular dramatic meals, but of countless ordinary ones. The weight of a bowl, the warmth of the fire, the sound of adults breathing nearby. You realize how tradition forms without announcement. No one decides that this is how things will always be done. It simply continues because it works. There is a small but telling detail in an old household letter describing how a grown child returning home after years away felt comforted and not by conversation, but by the smell and timing of supper. Familiarity healed distance. You feel that power now. Repetition reassures, and even when days are hard, the evening follows an own shape. Some observers suggest that family tradition in this period was less sentimental than functional. Others point out that function itself became meaning. Sitting here, you feel how both are true. Routine carries emotion even when emotion is not named. You notice how people refer to past meals without specifying dates. That night when the stew burned. The winter when bread ran that short. Memory groups itself around food naturally. These stories are not told tonight. They do not need to be. Their presence is felt in the way people move, the way they protect certain habits without knowing why. The table holds this accumulation. Every mark, every repair, every star stain is a record of evenings like this one. Tradition leaves physical traces as well as emotional ones. You sense how continuity offers stability in a world where much is uncertain. Crops fail, illness strikes, weather turns, supper returns. As the night deepens, the room grows quieter still. People settle into rest. The day has been placed carefully into the past. You feel how tradition does not resist change aggressively. It bends when necessary. New foods appear, new faces join, but the core rhythm remains. A child murmurs something half asleep or already drifting. An adult adjusts a blanket. The house moves toward a night as one. There is still discussion among those who study family life about how consciously people preserve tradition versus simply lived it. Written evidence favours practicality. Lived experience suggests comfort mattered too. You sense how these evenings built a sense of belonging that did not require explanation. Being here again tomorrow would be enough. The fire dims further, shadows thicken, the table fades into outline. You understand now that supper's greatest work happens after eating ends. It anchors time. It links yesterday to tomorrow. It tells the household who they are by how they end the day. As you stand within that understanding, you feel how tonight's meal will slip quietly into memory, joining countless others shaping expectation without effort. And as the room drifts towards sleep, you sense how tradition built one supper at a time carries the family forward, steady and unbroken into the next morning and the many evenings yet to come. Night has fully claimed the space now. The table is no longer a place of action, only a shape in the dimness. What mattered there has already happened. Supper has finished its work, and the household has begun the quiet turning inward that signals the end of the day. You feel it in your body first. The warmth of food settles lower. Muscles soften. Breathing deepens without instruction. The world narrows to what is close and known. People move with purpose again, but the purpose is gentler. A candle is trimmed. A door is checked. Bedding is arranged near the fire or farther away depending on preference and draft. These choices are made quickly, guided by habit. In many homes during the 1700s, evenings after supper blended directly into preparation for sleep. Without artificial light to stretch time, night shaped behaviour. The day closed when darkness said it should. You notice how voices stay low now, even when speaking from across the room. Sound feels heavier at night. It carries differently. Quiet becomes the safest tone. Children are guided toward rest without ceremony. No stories read aloud every night. No long negotiations. Sleep arrives as naturally as hunger did earlier. An adult stirs the fire one last time, not to brighten it, but to make it last. Embers are coaxed into a steady glow. Tomorrow's flame depends on tonight's care. You sense how supper has prepared everyone for this moment. Full stomachs make rest easier. Shared routine smooths the edges of worry. There is a brief moment when someone looks back toward the table, as if checking that everything is truly done. It is. Nothing remains unfinished. Some accounts from this period describe night as the most vulnerable time. Darkness hid danger. Cold crept in, yet it was also when people felt most enclosed by home. That balance remains here. You feel it now. The house holds together tightly around those inside it. Walls feel thicker. The outside world feels far away. As people settle into their sleeping places, the fire becomes the last shared focus. Its glow pulses slowly like a living thing breathing alongside the room. The day has been long. The meal was simple. Together they have been enough. You let your own attention drift. Thoughts slow. The details of supper blur into a single feeling of having been fed and included. The table fades fully into shadow. Tomorrow it will return to use. Night, it rests. You realize how little drama is needed to end a day well. Food, warmth, familiar presence, repetition doing its quiet work. As the house grows still, the only sounds left are breathing and the soft settling of wood as the temperature changes. Night deepens gently. You feel how supper has carried everyone here not just to the end of eating, but to the edge of sleep. And as the last movements cease and the fire holds its low glow, you drift with the household into rest, wrapped in the quiet assurance that comes from a day completed and a meal shared, leaving nothing more to ask of the night. Wind down. Now let everything soften even further. Imagine the house breathing slowly around you. The fire no longer crackles, it glows. The walls release the day's warmth, inch by inch. Outside the dark is conflat, but inside there is no urgency left. You are no longer thinking about what was eaten or who sat where. Those details dissolve into a single calm impression. Supper has done its work, and so has the day. Your body knows this rhythm. Eat, rest, sleep, repeat. It is older than clocks, older than houses built this way, older even than the table itself. Let your breathing match the room, slow even unforced. There is nothing left to plan tonight. Tomorrow will arrive when it arrives. For now you're allowed to stop. If your mind drifts back to the table, let it do so gently. See the bowls emptied, the bread gone, the fire low, everything accounted for. You are safe inside this moment, inside these walls, inside this quiet ending. Stay here as long as you like. There is no rush to fall asleep, rest is already happening. And as the night carries you further inward, let the last thought fade like firelight on wood, leaving you with nothing but warmth, stillness, and the simple comfort of having shared a meal and a day that is finally peacefully complete. Sweet dreams.